Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I would like to continue under item 7 with our next panel on electricity as a driver for transformation of energy. And I would like Jim Robb, the chair of the group of experts on cleaner electricity systems, to moderate this session, which is scheduled from 3 to 4:30 this afternoon. Please, Jim, go ahead.
Okay, well, let me just check that I have sound and video working.
It's perfect.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you here with you today. I was very honored to assume the role of the chair of the group of experts on cleaner electricity systems last year after the untimely passing of Barry Worthington. His shoes are hard to fill, of course. But I have enjoyed the opportunity to learn about the UNECE and to have an opportunity to contribute on a broader stage. Of course, I would much prefer to be with you in Geneva in person, as I'm sure we all would, and hopefully next year that will be a possibility. This afternoon, I'm going to moderate a panel discussion with 4 truly distinctive individuals on the opportunities and challenges in front of us to reach the UN's climate goals across the European Economic Commission nations. Electrification of our economies is one important option in the pathway to a net zero economy. Electricity can be economically produced from many fuels at very large scale and distributed cost effectively. Emissions from electricity production, for the near term anyway, will be largely concentrated in large central station generating plants, where they can be controlled, eliminated, or captured for other uses. Improving economics of renewable generation, particularly wind and solar, create zero emission production options, which many economies and nations are already benefiting from. Existing large-scale nuclear and hydroelectric production and promises of future small modular reactors can create additional zero emission electricity production options that could be produced at large scale. And finally, the potential for commercially viable carbon capture, use, and storage may extend the life and significantly reduce the carbon footprint associated with existing fossil generation. Over a longer term, the development of high capacity, long duration batteries and a clean hydrogen production and distribution system promises an alternative to natural gas for integration of variable energy production resources. Growing acceptance of electric vehicles and electric rail as an alternative to internal combustion and diesel engine powered transportation can also make a significant difference in the emissions profile of the transportation sector. Displacing locally produced space heating with electric technologies, particularly in milder climates, would make a material difference to that sector's carbon footprint. And ultimately, using electricity as the primary fuel for production of steam in a process-based manufacturing operation is another major opportunity in front of us. This afternoon, we've convened a terrific panel to discuss these opportunities and the challenges we will need to collectively overcome to achieve them. I'm going to be joined first by my good friend, Pedro Pizarro. Dr. Pizarro is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Edison International, which is the parent company of Southern California Edison. Southern California Edison, as you probably know, is the utility that serves the majority of Southern California in the United States. Last year, Edison published its vision of an electrified economy in California that is quite inspiring and well worth sharing with the committee. Next, I have Arshad Mansour, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI. Dr. Mansour is a highly energetic, brilliant, and highly inspirational leader for EPRI, which serves as a research collaborative for the electric power industry globally. And I've asked him to comment this afternoon on the state of electrification technology and the R&D priorities that industry needs to pursue to get those technologies over the goal line. We're then going to switch to perspectives from continental Europe and Central Asia. I am joined by Monsieur Cedric Lewandowski, the Group Executive Senior Vice President for Nuclear and Thermal Production for Électricité de France. EDF is one of the world's largest power producers. I've asked Monsieur Lewandowski to focus particularly on the role that nuclear may play in our clean energy future, as well as his views on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and opportunities for broader electrification of the economy on the path to net zero. And then finally, we are joined by Dr. Daniyar Zhirinchinov. Dr. Zhirinchinov is the chairman of the board of directors of the International Green Technologies and Investment Project Center of the Republic of Kazakhstan. I've asked Dr. Zhirinchinov to bring a public sector and investors' view on these opportunities, especially viewed through the lens of a currently fossil fuel-rich country such as Kazakhstan. So, gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today. I very much appreciate your time and your willingness to share your perspectives. And Dr. Pizarro, I'd like to start with you. And I'd also like to note that it's 6 a.m. in Southern California, and very much appreciate your willingness to give us some of your time so early in the morning. Last year, Southern California Edison published a white paper with its view of a decarbonized energy sector and the role that the utility could play in making that vision a reality. More recently, you were featured in a podcast produced by the Edison Electric Institute with your views on how we achieve net zero. It's a compelling vision, but I'm wondering if you can, in 5 to 7 minutes, summarize that vision for us. So Pedro, over to you.
Could you please unmute Mr. Pizarro, please?
Thank you very much. Sorry, I think the host may have had some technical difficulties here. Can you see me okay now? Great. Well, Jim, thanks very much for inviting me, and I want to thank the Committee on Sustainable Energy for also inviting me to participate today. It is 6 a.m. Normally I would be running, so now I get to run with you all virtually. Jim, to answer your question, ultimately, we share the vision that our state of California has to reach carbon neutrality by 2045, and we have to do so in a way that's inclusive of all, especially our most vulnerable communities who continue to suffer the most from changing climate. Here in California, we have some of the most ambitious and forward-looking climate policies in the United States, with the goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2045, while reducing GHG emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So it's a waypoint on the way to 2045, all aligned with the Paris Agreement. California's $3.2 trillion economy is the 5th largest economy in the world, and we have a real opportunity to make a significant impact leading the clean energy transition. In November 2019, our utility, Southern California Edison, published its Pathway 2045 policy paper and analyzed how the California economy as a whole can get to its 2030 and 2045 decarbonization goals. And what we found was that the transition is achievable and affordable, but it will require a significant push by both the power sector to clean our supply and by the rest of the economy to electrify much of other sectors. Some of the tenets of that, or the tools, we see 100% of delivered retail electricity coming from carbon-free resources by 2045. That will require a massive investment in renewables, with an addition of 80 gigawatts of utility-scale renewables and 30 gigawatts of distributed renewables across the state. That will need to be complemented by 30 gigawatts of utility-scale storage and 10 gigawatts of distributed storage. All that clean power can then be used to efficiently electrify transportation, buildings, and other sectors in the economy. To give you a sense of how large a push this has to be, we estimate that by 2045, we will need 26 million electric vehicles on our roads, meaning 3/4 of passenger vehicles, 2/3 of medium duty, and 1/3 of heavy-duty vehicles that will need to be electric. We also see buildings requiring significant electrification, 70% of space and water heating. All of this will lead to significant electricity demand in California. We see that increasing 60% by 2045, with peak load increasing by 40%. Now, these investments are a significant development opportunity and need, and we see just the investments to support the grid and add storage and renewables requiring $250 billion in an investment across our state by 2045. But of course, we also see the need for additional investments across other sectors of the economy to adopt technologies like electric vehicles, heat pumps, and electric stoves. The good news in all of this is that we see the transition being affordable due to the greater efficiency of electric technologies. And we estimate that the average consumer in California will spend more on electricity, but as you look at their total spend across all energy needs, electricity, gasoline, petrol, natural gas, they will spend 1/3 less in real terms than they do today. So that's a benefit of the transition, and we're committed to helping lead that. Our utility has been taking big steps already, including having the largest investor-owned utility suite of programs in the United States to support charging infrastructure, with over $800 million committed and approved by our regulators to support 38,000 passenger vehicle chargers and 8,500 industrial, medium, and heavy-duty electric vehicles in the next several years. We've also published a white paper last year called Reimagining the Grid that talks about how the grid itself will need to evolve with more efficient electrification of clean resources, supporting electrification and customer choices. Outside of our utility, we also have Edison Energy, which is providing comprehensive and data-driven solutions to large commercial and industrial customers who are themselves engaged in the transition by building sustainability into their operations, particularly around energy utilization. And Edison Energy today is serving 20 of the Fortune 100 in both the United States and globally in Europe, Canada, Mexico, and increasingly in Asia. We also have a small but mighty growth and innovation team that is helping us invest in emerging technologies with the potential to support carbon neutrality. So we make selective investments in early stage companies that can help with the transition. So Jim, to sum it up, this transition to decarbonization is feasible. It can be affordable. It will require dramatic increases in renewable energy and storage, but importantly, it will require a significant transition in the rest of the economy, in transportation, buildings, industrial uses, to use electricity or to use low carbon fuels like clean hydrogen for hard to electrify applications, along with carbon capture to balance the system. Hope that gives you an overview of how we're viewing the potential opportunity here.
Terrific. I'm just getting used to the mute and unmute feature. Well, Dr. Pizarro, it is, of course, a very compelling vision, and I've always admired Edison for its leadership on so many different dimensions, and you're clearly continuing that in this area. I'm wondering, you know, the utility clearly can be at the center of decarbonization through electrification, but you probably, as you say, can't do it all on your own. I wonder if you could take a minute and expand on your last comment around what all needs to come into place, in your view, to make this vision a practical reality. And I'm thinking here of technology developments, market design issues, or anything that you think needs to be really put in place more broadly in order for you to be able to do the part that you can play.
Well, Jim, I think we need to emulate what the global scientific community did in helping address the COVID concerns and come together and develop a multiple set of technologies across the whole economy to achieve this. We have a lot of the technology needed already to get to around 2030, but we need significant development to get to 2045. We need better, more efficient technologies for renewables and storage. We'll need new chemistries beyond lithium ion and continue to work on energy efficiency. We also need developments in zero carbon fuels like hydrogen, and looking forward to hearing Dr. Arshad Mansour's comments next, given EPRI's role in that. We need to better manage a more complex grid. That will need to include having strong cybersecurity protections as we go to a more distributed set of generation resources with a larger attack surface across the grid. This will require significant funding for technology deployment across the entire time horizon, and it will require basic research, development, and deployment across the whole economy to minimize the cost of a net zero carbon economy. You mentioned policy as well, so it's not just about technology. We also need commitment from our federal and state governments in the United States and from global governments around the world, with regulators, customers, and investors all moving in this transition forward in a meaningful way. You know, sitting here in California, the world's fifth largest economy, despite it being an early and aggressive leader in addressing climate change, we're still seeing a gap between our emissions reduction trajectory based on current policies and where the state needs to be to meet its goals. And in fact, later today, tomorrow for some of you, we will be releasing a new policy paper that identifies some of the policy changes and actions that we believe are needed to ensure that California can meet its goal, its interim goal of 40% reductions by 2030. It's interesting when you look at the state, it's already reduced GHG emissions on average around 1% per year since 2005. Which has been notable since the economy has grown by 3% per year over the same period. But now to get to 2030, we believe California will have to quadruple that annual emissions reduction rate. So there's a number of policies that the state will need to accelerate in the next 12 to 18 months to get to 2030. And I think that's an example of what will need to be happening globally so we can all contribute to the solution.
Terrific. Thank you, Pedro, very, very much. And I think what is most stunning to me is the scale of the changes that need to be put into place. And you know, you sitting in Southern California, you probably have the most rich set of resources to draw from. And it's interesting to me that even with that extraordinary base and a very aggressive state support, how daunting this challenge still sounds when you talk through the changes that need to be put in place. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to talk specifically about technology and the opportunities that are in front of us in that space to make this vision a reality. So for that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Arshad Mansour of EPRI. Dr. Mansour, Arshad, I'm hoping that you're there. I know that EPRI works on a wide variety of issues and has been a leading thinker on decarbonization pathways and strategies for a long time. And I recollect 10 plus years ago, the initial work that EPRI did on the PRISM pathway project back when I was at Northeast Utilities. From your perspective, how close do you think we are to having the key technologies and the capabilities in place to make the vision that Pedro has described a reality, both in a state like California, a country like the United States, and more broadly across the European Economic Commission footprint? So Arshad, over to you.
Right, thank you, Jim. It's an honor and pleasure to be here today. I think I'll dovetail nicely Dr. Pizarro's state of California, what California needs to do. When we think about technology, let's look at the scale of the challenge we have and opportunity we have. More than 84% of the energy that we use globally is fossil fuel. Only 16%, less than 20% is electrified. And even electricity is not today produced from clean resources everywhere. And it took us 130 years as a world to move electricity to be 20% of our final energy. We now have an opportunity, and we must almost accelerate that electrification by 4 to 5 times in the near term. So when we look at a technology, we look at what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Do the technologies exist? Where do we see innovation? But also, what do we do in the next 30 years to get to net zero by 2050? So let's talk about the next 10 years innovation needs. Electrification technologies exist to have a ramp up of 4x more rate of electrification globally. Now, the key technology for electrification that will drive that is batteries. And I'm talking about short-term batteries in your transportation and short-term 2, 4, 6 hour batteries on the grid. And the innovation that has happened in the battery is in manufacturing process and production. We had in 2010, a kilowatt hour of battery would have been $1,000. In 2021, it's $100, $125. That's the scale that we have reduced, not through an innovative breakthrough, but the same way wind and solar has happened. We expect that cost to come down, but there's an area of battery where we think the innovation in the automotive industry and battery sector will help us this decade. Is while we can still produce cars, you see some announcements of automotive passenger cars with 500-mile range. So range is getting better, but it still takes us an hour, 50 minutes, hour and a half to charge the car. To electrify transportation, we also have to fundamentally figure out how to reduce that time. And there is significant work that has happened in solid state batteries over the last decades, which is now coming to fruition. And imagine what solid state electronics did 40 years ago when we went from vacuum tube to solid state electronics. Solid state battery in the next 3-4 years could make a change. And the biggest change would be you should be able to get a tank full of electricity to drive your car, maybe within 10 to 15 minutes. So that's a big change on the battery side that will drive further innovation. But the real challenge in this decade is what Dr. Pizarro mentioned, reimagine the grid. So the electric sector, the way we plan, design, operate, protect, the way we provide ancillary services, the way inertia works in an electric grid will all need to be rethought. The way we think about resource adequacy, do we have enough resource to meet the electric need at any time, needs to be rethought. And rethought means we need innovation in the way we have designed, we have protect, and we operate the grid. And that would be a key need in this decade to ramp up electrification. Go to another technology, heating. Over today in US, roughly 30 to 40% of heating residential comes from heat pump. We are seeing tremendous opportunity in technology advancement in heat pump. Heat pump are becoming more and more likely for colder climate. On the industrial side, significant technology already exists, infrared drying, microwave drying, that can replace industrial heating. The challenge is access to capital and an incentive to make that change on an existing plant. But now if you take your vision to 2050 and you say, let's say we have electrified the passenger cars, we've electrified some industry, and we have electrified transportation. But how do we get to net zero? And this is where the biggest innovation need is this decade, so we are ready beyond 2030, is how do we create molecules of energy? Today, molecules of energies are natural gas, petroleum. How do we create those molecules in a clean way? There's a lot of work happening on hydrogen. Electricity could be a key source to create hydrogen through electrolysis, through other areas. You're looking at advanced nuclear, and advanced nuclear could be a source for hydrogen, electricity, and steam. And then you have the amount of fossil fuel we have in this world. Without carbon capture and storage becoming economical and deployed, we are not going to meet the global need just in the next 30 years to go to net zero when 84% of the energy that we spend is fossil fuel. So reimagining the grid and reimagining how clean energy carrier or energy molecules can be affordably produced, transported, and used using clean electricity. I think those are the two biggest opportunities for innovation we have, both in the near term and in the long term, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Arshad. I think your audio cut out there at the end, but I think you were about to address the topic of the question I was going to ask you anyway. And I very much appreciate the perspective, the confidence, and the energy that you bring to these opportunities in front of us. And I'm just curious from your perspective of the range of technologies that may be necessary going forward, which two do you think are the most critical? And the one or two, and the one that I'd love for you to talk a little bit about are your views on batteries or energy storage, I should say, beyond the electric vehicle, small capacity, short duration, but the kind of storage that the grid is likely to require at the bulk power level.
Thank you, Jim. I hope you can hear me now. If you look at near term with 10 years, I think the biggest opportunity of innovation is reimagining grid and reimagining markets that helps us to operate the grid, because we will see significant ramp up on electricity. Not all of it will be enabled by more transmission, more distribution, and more generation. We need to think of a completely integrated grid where these resources are also coming from the customer side. We need to rethink markets on how do you do resource adequacy when just in US, we think we will have 600 to 800 gigawatt of wind and solar, and today we have 200. So I think that is the innovation need near term. Longer term, and you hit the right point, if you electrify, let's say heating in UK, your electricity need during the coldest day would be 4 to 5 times more than you have today. That is not economical to transform your entire heating to electricity and have an electric generation and transmission and distribution system that can scale up to 5 times. Today, we use natural gas as a storage, and we have months of storage. What we need to do tomorrow, and this is where the opportunity for hydrogen is the most, is in 2 ways. One, if we have that amount of renewables in the global power system, we need storage that are weeks and months, not hours or days. And hydrogen, compressed air, these are all opportunities that in a stage, it's not ready for it to be deployed. But there's another reason why we need this storage medium and why we need hydrogen. You can't electrify everything. You can't electrify the entire heating in a cold climate like UK. So could hydrogen be the fuel for heating in some areas, while hydrogen is also the fuel or the energy storage for a 1 month energy storage, let's say that you need seasonal variation. So I think on the storage side, while we will see lithium ion still progressing, solid state will become a reality. The opportunity to make hydrogen production, delivery, and use affordable and scalable is really what we need to figure out in this decade.
Terrific. Arshad, thank you very, very much for those views. And for the committee, I'm going to go through our next two panelists. I have a question for each of them to answer, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions as well. I think at this point, I'm going to cross the pond, if you will, and would like to hear from Monsieur Lewandowski. Monsieur Lewandowski, France a long time ago made a commitment to clean energy through its exceptional nuclear program. Some countries may choose to pursue nuclear power with the view that it can play an important role in their energy mix as a viable decarbonization option. Other countries have decided not to use nuclear for a variety of reasons, some because of the endowment of natural resources and others because of their concerns relative to safety and waste. I wonder if you could share your views and the views of EDF on the role of nuclear in our future and how you're thinking about opportunities for electrification of the economy on the path to net zero. So, Monsieur Lewandowski.
Thank you, Jim, for your invitation. I will switch to French. And d'abord, vous dire à quel point c'est un plaisir de participer à cette table ronde.
In this round table, and the work being done by the
de l'ONU
Европейской экономической комиссии по вопросу, который является, естественно, важным и актуальным. Джим, отвечая на вопрос, я думаю, что информация совершенно здесь четкая. Климатические действия необходимо предпринимать как можно скорее. Мы не можем позволить себе потепление планеты, и мы должны не допустить потепления больше, чем на 2 градуса, то есть выполнить Парижские соглашения. Я думаю, что в этом плане у нас имеется консенсус. Вопрос в том, как это сделать. Я думаю, что вы не удивитесь, если услышите, что EDF придерживается такой же позиции, как и большинство экспертов. Я имею в виду доклад межправительственной группы экспертов МГИКа, Международного энергетического агентства, а также я ссылаюсь на ваш доклад в том, что касается ядерной энергетики. Решения, я думаю, здесь прекрасно всем известны, и их разделяют многие. Необходимо действовать решительно и быстро, как минимум в 3 направлениях. Первое – это, конечно, электрификация пользователей. Международное агентство энергетики сообщает, что необходимо от 20 до 60% перейти к использованию электроэнергии, то есть электрифицировать все отрасли транспорта, строительства, жилье в 3 раза больше, чем сейчас. То есть это означает повысить как минимум в 3 раза производство электроэнергии. Написано на 15-20%. Первый вопрос – электрификация. Второе – это обезуглероживание, декарбонизация. То есть здесь необходимо быстрее действовать. Если обратиться к истории, последний отказ от углерода в электроэнергии имел место как раз во Франции в 80-е годы, когда мы создали наш парк атомных электростанций. Здесь мы действовали быстро, использовав для этого большие средства. Мы должны использовать все имеющиеся средства, и здесь все возможности открыты. Я думаю, что первые коллеги, которые выступали, об этом сказали. Энергия солнца, ветра, как офшорная, так и на берегу, на суше. Необходимо будет повысить в 3-4 раза создание этих новых средств для того, чтобы откликнуться на спрос электроэнергии без использования углерода. ЭДФ является первым оператором в мире в том, что касается атомной электроэнергии. Мы считаем, что атомная энергетика является важной, и отказаться от атомной энергии – это потерять 10-15 лет борьбы против климатических изменений. Здесь мы должны придерживаться здравого смысла. В 2000 году ископаемое топливо было 80% на долю ископаемого топлива приходилось. 20 лет спустя доля не изменилась, те же 80%. То есть возобновляемые источники энергии, новые источники энергии лишь только компенсируют закрытие существующих реакторов. Это движение необходимо прекратить закрывать существующие атомные электростанции, если можно продлить их срок эксплуатации. Как раз это мы и делаем во Франции. Мы продлили срок более чем 40 лет он стал. И США такие же программы проводят. Срок эксплуатации представляет более 40 лет. Мы должны инвестировать, и ЭДФ тратит 4 миллиарда евро в год на продление срока эксплуатации существующих атомных электростанций. И, конечно же, надо новые атомные электростанции строить, так как именно ядерная атомная энергетика позволит нам оказаться на высоте той проблемы, которая перед нами стоит, и действовать быстро. И здесь, вы меня как раз попросили об этом сказать, мы в ЭДФ проводим ряд программ в Великобритании, в Австралии и в Индии Аджхапур программа обсуждается. Поэтому необходимо действовать быстро и решительно. И такая необходимость назрела сейчас как никогда. Атомная электроэнергия – это та энергия, которая представляет целый ряд преимуществ. Я 3 преимущества назову. Во-первых, с экономической точки зрения, это энергия, если говорить о существующей атомной энергетике, это дешевая энергия. Это, наверное, самое дешевое средство предоставления электроэнергии без использования углерода. Это не я вам говорю, это Международное агентство энергетики, наш друг Роль об этом говорит, он об этом недавно сказал. Это плотная энергия, энергетическая плотность атомной электроэнергии от 100 до 1000 раз больше, чем любая другая форма электроэнергии. Я имею в виду энергию солнца и ветра. И поэтому в густонаселенных странах этот вопрос становится все более и более важным. И, наконец, этот вид энергии позволяет охранять окружающую среду. Недавно мы доказали, что будь то в плане использования структурных материалов или высокотехнологичных материалов, по сравнению с объемом производимой энергии, атомная энергия потребляет наименьшее количество ресурсов, наверное. И здесь мы все согласимся, что мы не должны заменять нашу зависимость от нефти новой зависимостью от меди или кобальта. И здесь атомная энергетика является важным средством. МВФ показал, что атомная энергетика имеет эффект множителя роста, очень существенный, в 2-3 раза больше, чем другие виды энергии. Поэтому атомная электроэнергия способствует экономическому росту. И, наконец, атомная электроэнергия – это местный вид энергии, энергия инноваций, талантов, опыта. И поэтому она способствует очень существенному экономическому развитию. Поэтому, Джим, я еще раз хочу высказать такую поддержку атомной электроэнергии, не только потому, что это наша профессия, а потому, что мы действительно думаем, что взаимодополняемость атомной электроэнергии и возобновляемых источников энергии позволит нам оказаться на высоте тех высоких задач, которые перед нами стоят. Мне не слышно. Спасибо. Спасибо, господин Левандовский. Я больше всего сожалею, что не выучил французский язык, когда был в старших классах школы. Но спасибо за то, что вы поделились своими соображениями. Одна из областей, которые меня заинтриговали, это возможность небольших модульных реакторов, которые могут быть быстро и затраты эффективно разработаны и развернуты. Поэтому один из важнейших вопросов энергетики будущего, если подумать о вариации производства электроэнергии, также гибкое топливо, гибкая генерация ресурсов генерирования. Насколько я понимаю, существующие реакторы ЭДФ могут действовать гибко, по крайней мере, более гибко, чем реакторы в США, с тем, чтобы сбалансировать спрос и предложение. Возобновляемые источники имеют все большую долю. Думаете ли вы, что атомная электроэнергия, новые технологии, такие как модульные реакторы, предоставят необходимую гибкость для того, чтобы задействовать эту необходимость варьирующуюся предоставления ресурсов? Да, совершенно очевидно. Мы считаем, что маленькие реакторы СМР, малые модульные реакторы, совершенно очевидно, это залог гибкости, которая будет необходима в будущем. Наш нынешний парк реакторов уже является гибким. Он может перейти от 100% до 20% производства очень быстро. Это позволяет нам очень приспособиться к меняющемуся спросу в Европе. Но для различных типов нового пользования, о которых можно уже сейчас задуматься, строительство малых реакторов СМР
importante et sur laquelle nous allons tous travailler. Alors, le monde entier travaille sur cette question à des horizons très différents. Hein. On a des objets qui sont entre 10 et 300 mégawatts. Donc, derrière le mot SMR, il y a énormément de technologies en cause. Mais le monde entier, en particulier évidemment les États-Unis et la Russie, ont pris sur ce terrain-là déjà un certain nombre d'options. Nous-mêmes, de notre côté, nous avons travaillé avec quelques partenaires sur la recherche d'un SMR français, en tout cas que la filière française pourrait assumer. Le projet s'appelle New World, qui s'appuie sur une technologie de réacteur à eau pressurisée, qui est effectivement bien maîtrisée par notre filière. Il est très compact, avec une durée visée de construction d'environ 40 mois. On parle donc là de l'horizon 2030. Si effectivement les SMR sont bien au rendez-vous, ils auront plein d'avantages, des avantages probablement en termes de sécurité et de sûreté, des avantages à l'égard d'un certain nombre de types de demandes. On pense par exemple à la désalinisation d'eau de mer ou à la production de stocks d'hydrogène. Ça fait partie des sujets qui sont sur la table, donc pour des nouveaux usages. C'est aussi, bien évidemment, extrêmement attractif pour des jeunes générations de s'intéresser à des produits qui sont très innovants. Et donc, on le voit, les écoles d'ingénierie rivalisent d'intelligence un peu partout dans le monde sur le sujet SMR. Et donc, oui, nous pensons que les SMR seront demain un des éléments de la flexibilité de l'ensemble du système énergétique, avec un point sur lequel je réinsiste et que j'évoquais tout à l'heure, à minima sur la plaque européenne, nous allons avoir besoin de beaucoup d'électricité dans les années qui viennent. Nous avons une question de sécurité d'approvisionnement qui est d'ores et déjà sur la table et posée en tant que telle. Et donc, à cet égard, nous aurons besoin de tous les moyens disponibles décarbonés. Bien sûr, les énergies nouvelles, mais aussi tous les moyens possibles en termes nucléaires, autrement dit de la forte puissance, de la moyenne puissance ou de la petite puissance, pour assurer cette combinaison au secours, certes, de la flexibilité, mais d'abord et avant tout de la sécurité d'approvisionnement.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much, merci, Mr. Lewandowski. And now I'd like to move to the eastern part of the UNECE region and invite Dr. Jirenchinov from Kazakhstan to make a few comments. Dr. Jirenchinov, I understand that you and your organization are very committed to strengthening regional dialogue, exchanging best practices to make science-based and climate-resilient decisions, and proactively seeking opportunities to attract international finance to clean energy infrastructure projects in Central Asia. Could you please share with us how such a fossil fuel-rich country and fossil fuel-dependent country as Kazakhstan is thinking about and approaching their ability to achieve a substantially reduced emissions profile? I would be really interested in hearing your observations on that issue and also the investment priorities that the organization that you chair is finding most attractive. Dr. Jirenchinov?
Спасибо большое за возможность поучаствовать в такой серьезной конференции по всем острым вопросам, которые интересуют весь мир. Я являюсь председателем Совета директоров некоммерческого акционерного общества Международный центр зеленых технологий и инвестиционных проектов. Нашим акционером является Министерство экологии, геологии и природных ресурсов Республики Казахстан. И я сегодня хотел бы рассказать о тех мероприятиях, которые предпринимает правительство Казахстана для достижения целей устойчивого развития, для перехода на рельсы зеленой экономики. В 2013 году Казахстан утвердил концепцию по переходу Казахстана к зеленой экономике, определив целевые индикаторы по основным направлениям в области водных ресурсов, сельского хозяйства, энергоэффективности, электроэнергетики, загрязнения воздуха, утилизации отходов. С 2020 по 2030 год идет уже второй этап ее реализации – преобразования национальной экономики, ориентированной на рациональное использование природных ресурсов, поощрение и стимулирование развития и широкое внедрение технологий возобновляемой энергетики. В целях развития альтернативной энергетики, поддержки отечественных и иностранных инвесторов действует соответствующий закон о поддержке использования возобновляемых источников энергии. С 2018 года отбор для реализации проектов по возобновляемым источникам энергии проходит по аукционному механизму. Это позволило, с одной стороны, сделать прозрачным и понятным процесс отбора проектов и инвесторов, с другой стороны, сделать ставку на более эффективные технологии и проекты, позволяющие минимизировать влияние на тарифы у конечных потребителей, что очень важно, от ввода мощностей возобновляемых источников энергии. За последние 4 года в сектор возобновляемых источников энергии путем подписания ряда соглашений, меморандумов с международными финансовыми институтами и организациями привлечены инвестиции на сумму порядка $613 миллионов США. Казахстан – одна из самых энергоемких стран в мире. На сегодня порядка 70% электроэнергии вырабатывается в стране за счет традиционных тепловых станций, работающих на угле. При этом доля выработки возобновляемых источников энергии пока составляет 3%. Президентом нашей страны поставлены цели по достижению этого показателя до 15% к 2030 году. В 2016 году Казахстан подписал Парижское соглашение, взяв на себя обязательства по сокращению выбросов парниковых газов на 15% к 2030 году от уровня 1990 года. Выступая на саммите по климатическим амбициям в 2020 году, президент Казахстана господин Токаев объявил о достижении углеродной нейтральности Казахстана к 2060 году. Эти амбициозные планы для нашей страны, поскольку добывающий сектор составляет 50% промышленности. В связи с этим глава государства назвал экологизацию добывающей промышленности первостепенной задачей и абсолютным приоритетом в деле устойчивого развития Казахстана. Для выполнения поставленных целей разрабатывается концепция низкоуглеродного развития Казахстана до 2050 года. Она в этом месяце будет презентована. Мы планируем до конца года придать ей законодательную основу. Этот документ должен будет содержать конкретное видение глубокой и структурной декарбонизации экономики. Одним из инструментов стимулирования предприятий к уменьшению негативного воздействия на окружающую среду является система торговли квотами на выбросы парниковых газов. Казахстан является первой страной в Центральной Азии, которая приняла законодательство и внедрила национальную систему торговли квотами на выбросы. В настоящее время поставлена задача, идет ее перезапуск с учетом и синхронизации с аналогичными мировыми.
In 2021, a new environmental code was adopted aimed at weighted towards the most advanced practices. And one of the principles of the code.
Ce code sera l'accès.
2025 года все крупные предприятия должны будут переходить на наилучшие доступные технологии, которые нацелены на повышение энергоэффективности, сокращение потребления ресурсов и в итоге на снижение вредного воздействия на окружающую среду. Также в соответствии с опытом передовых стран успешное управление влиянием на окружающую среду зависит от эффективного взаимодействия между государством, промышленностью и гражданским обществом со связующей ролью в виде рабочего органа по наилучшим доступным технологиям. Такой рабочий орган, как Бюро наилучших доступных технологий, создано на основе нашего Центра зеленых технологий. Основной задачей рабочего органа является институциализация, мониторинг перехода к принципам НДТ посредством разработки отраслевых справочников наилучших доступных технологий. Общество занимается вопросами оказания содействия перехода Республики Казахстан на принципы наилучших доступных технологий. Наша компания именно этим занимается на протяжении 3 лет. Изучен международный опыт стран по переходу и внедрению НДТ, разработана концепция по переходу Республики Казахстан на принципы наилучших доступных технологий. Генетическим кодом международного центра является программа партнерства «Зеленый мост», которая была предложена Казахстаном и поддержана международным сообществом. Совместно на основе этой программы, совместно с региональным экологическим центром Центральной Азии, создается региональное Центральноазиатское бюро наилучших доступных технологий. Также в рамках наших региональных инициатив Казахстан готов стать региональным хабом климатическим в Центральной Азии по климатическим вопросам. Деятельность хаба будет направлена на объединение усилий стран Центральной Азии в обеспечении зеленого экономического роста в регионе через реализацию проектов, трансфер технологий, обмен знаниями и инновациями. Региональный хаб создается при Международном центре зеленых технологий. Также переход на зеленую экономику невозможен без развитой системы зеленого финансирования. В связи с этим, с учетом международного опыта, правительством Казахстана в новом экологическом кодексе предложен механизм экспертизы зеленых проектов. Нами, как центром, на основе лучших мировых практик развивается направление так называемой зеленой таксономии. Единая система классификации для устойчивой деятельности предлагает единую систему терминологии в области финансирования устойчивого развития. Единая система классификации должна внести ясность в отношении того, какие виды экономической деятельности соответствуют принципам устойчивого развития. Международный центр также провел обширный анализ международного опыта по зеленой таксономии, включая сравнительный анализ таксономии стран Китая, России, Монголии, Европейского Союза. По результатам анализа мы определили ряд принципов отбора пороговых значений. Основной целенаправленностью отобранных порогов является оказание содействия достижению целевых индикаторов, концепции по переходу Республики Казахстан к зеленой экономике и достижению обязательств Парижского соглашения по климату. Также для объективности, эффективности и прозрачности зеленых инвестиций, освоения зеленых инвестиций, мы приняли решение разработать систему управления экологическими, климатическими, региональными рисками. Данная система будет заниматься прогнозированием страновых экологических и региональных рисков, выработки рекомендаций по их решению. Экологические риски создают опасность возникновения отрицательных изменений в окружающей среде или неблагоприятных последствий этих изменений. Они могут быть вызваны чрезвычайными ситуациями природного, антропогенного или техногенного характера. С данной инициативой мы выступали на региональном уровне. Она поддержана многими международными организациями. И мы бы ее хотели предложить как основной продукт, который позволит увеличить транспарентность освоения зеленых инвестиций в регионе Центральной Азии. Спасибо большое за внимание.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zheranowski, or excuse me, Dr. Zherenchenov. Thank you very much. That's a very interesting perspective. And I wonder if you could comment specifically on any opportunities, specific opportunities you see within Kazakhstan that would make use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. From everything I've seen, from the UN's own work to recent work that EPRI's conducted on pathways, fossil fuels are not going to go away anytime real soon. And some way of handling the carbon emissions from them will be critical. CCUS is the key technology to enable those resources to participate in a net zero economy. Can you share any views you have on the potential and time frame for large scale CCUS development?
Господин Роб, это очень актуальный вопрос для нашей страны, потому что угольная энергетика является основой нашей энергетической системы. И отказ полностью от угольной энергетики в кратчайшие сроки, конечно же, невозможен. Необходимо реалистично подходить ко всем сценариям развития зеленой экономики. Поэтому новые технологии по улавливанию, накоплению и дальнейшему использованию углерода сейчас активно рассматриваются в нашей стране. Скажем так, наша нефтяная промышленность при добыче нефти и газа уже косвенным образом использует эти технологии путем закачки попутных газов в пласт, обратно в пласт. Понятное дело, что попутные газы содержат парниковые газы, метан, СО2 и так далее. Это является одним из способов улавливания углерода, его накопления и хранения. Но основу, как я уже сказал в своем докладе, 50% нашей экономики составляет горнодобывающие металлургические предприятия, для которых система улавливания углерода на источники выбросов сейчас крайне актуальна. И мы, как Международный центр зеленых технологий, наша философия работы – это быть мостом для передачи и прохождения зеленых инвестиций, зеленых технологий не только в Казахстан, но и в регион Центральной Азии, глубоко заинтересованы, чтобы найти партнеров и в тестовом режиме начинать осваивать эти технологии на конкретных предприятиях по производству алюминия, меди, цинка, свинца, стали. Здесь очень широкий спектр для применения этих технологий. Мы, как Международный центр, обладаем и полномочиями, приданными нами государству для привлечения инвестиций, и очень обширным функционалом для сопровождения, обеспечения прозрачности, эффективности и объективности инвестиционных процессов и освоения новых технологий с любыми международными партнерами.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Zhirinchinov, very much. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing your perspectives with us. I think this discussion has clearly shown the range of challenges and opportunities that we have in front of us, and the extreme diversity of those challenges as we move from the furthest west to the furthest east within the UNECE region. I have one question I'd like to ask each of the panelists to answer, and then I'll open the floor to questions from the committee. My question to each of you, and this is motivated by my secretariat's position to me that we should always be looking for tangible, concrete actions that we can take as a result of our work. I'm wondering, given your experience, the opportunities you see in front of you and the issues and challenges that you face in making this green energy future a reality, what would be the single most important enabler, either technology, policy, or market related, that would help you play the role that you'd like to play to contribute to the UNECE's goals? So Pedro, I think I'll start with you, and then we'll move again west to east. So Pedro?
Well, I don't know that there's one single tool, but I will say bold policy actions. Time is running short. I think this will require some significant sense of risk taking, not only by private industry, but also by governments, by regulators. And so a lot of our message here in California and in the United States is one of, we recognize that there will be risks that need to be taken. There may be mistakes that get made along the way, but we are past the time when we can do small pilots or do small trials. We need to take bold policy action together.
Terrific. Arshad, Dr. Mansour, your views.
I think, Jim, I'll put a 10-year time frame and a 30-year time frame. In the near term, I think this whole concept of reimagining markets, power markets, reimagining the grid that will be working in a very different normal with high level of variable generation, with storage and the weather patterns as we are seeing worldwide. Even though we are reducing carbon emission, our weather patterns, the extreme weathers are happening everywhere. So the resiliency of the grid will need to be a different place in this 10 years time frame than it was past. Longer term, I think this is the decade we have to advance technologies at scale so that we can take care of a large percent of the energy that is used today by fossil fuel. And you heard about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And there's a question on storage. Assuring stakeholders and communities that CO2 can be sequestered safely, I think, is one of the biggest opportunity and challenge we have. And then we'll also have to figure out how to create clean molecules, synthetic methane, hydrogen, liquid ammonia. And these are the molecules that will allow us to get to net zero. And this is the decade to scale them up.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Arshad. Monsieur Lewandowski, your views, please.
Je suis bien sûr d'accord avec ce que viennent d'évoquer Pedro et Arshad. J'ajouterais dans le domaine nucléaire un double sujet, mais les deux sont intimement liés, c'est d'avoir des politiques de long terme. Ce qu'il y a de très difficile dans notre métier, ce sont les stop and go. Or, nous avons besoin, quand on travaille sur une industrie de ce type-là, qui travaille à l'échelle du siècle, d'avoir des politiques constantes et bien tenues sur la durée. Et notamment, c'est mon deuxième point, mais qui est complètement lié, pour disposer évidemment de stratégies d'investissement qui soient favorables. Il faut de bons signaux d'investissement pour que, évidemment, des coûts du capital engagé très importants quand on construit une centrale nucléaire soient clairement et intelligemment partagés entre, bien évidemment, les producteurs, les États, les consommateurs. C'est donc cet ensemble-là qui parfois fait défaut ou a fait défaut, qui nous met dans une situation qui est relativement compliquée aujourd'hui. Donc je plaide pour des politiques de long terme qui nous permettent des stratégies d'investissement de long terme.
Merci. And Dr. Yerbenchikov, your views, please.
Знаете, мы имеем дело с бизнесом. Все добывающие, перерабатывающие отрасли – это бизнес, которому необходима экономическая мотивация для внедрения зеленых технологий, для внедрения наилучших доступных практик. В данном случае для Казахстана сейчас очень важно предметно – это интеграция системы торговли парниковыми газами Казахстана с европейской системой торговых выбросов. В рамках вступающего в силу в будущем механизма пограничного углеродного налога со стороны Европейского Союза нам крайне важно интегрироваться в эту систему для того, чтобы быть единой системой, для того, чтобы мы друг друга прекрасно понимали, это чтобы был мотивационный механизм для нашей промышленности. На мой взгляд, наиболее эффективный инструмент для ускорения перехода к зеленой экономике – это развитие рынка углеродных единиц. Спасибо.
Terrific. Thank you all very, very much. And surprisingly, I'm right on time. We have about 20 minutes for questions from the floor. And I see we have a number in the chat. I think I want to start with a couple folks who are in the room in Geneva. And Eva, I think we can open the mic directly to them. But maybe we could start with, is it Marek Kubik?
Am I connected? Yes. Yeah, hi, thank you. Marek Kubik, I'm Managing Director at Fluid's energy storage technology company. So perhaps it's no surprise that I'm going to be directing my question to Arshad, who I think put a very interesting perspective out on the future of the grid. And I think in the last comments as well, this remark about where the boundary of electrons versus molecules is in terms of storage. So I think very accurate to say the historic trend of battery energy storage costs, particularly lithium ion, has been very steep over the last 10 years. And today we already see, although mostly in Europe, the systems that are being installed for grid storage are mostly a couple of hours, 1, 2. There are many commercial systems of 4 to 6 hours around the world with lithium ion batteries, even in some extreme cases, 8 hours. But that's the picture today. And what I'm curious to hear is the view that with the continuing falling cost trends of lithium ion and potentially other storage technologies, where will this ultimate boundary sit between the electron and the molecule? Is it 10 hours, 12 hours? Are we able to get to a certain boundary where batteries are going to solve a certain amount of the problem? And where does the piece with molecules sit where you need to solve the weekly or seasonal storage? Thank you.
Jim, a great question. I think I'll answer it in two parts. One part is where is the boundary between molecules and electrons for decarbonizing the entire economy? I think it's feasible that a point in the future, 50 to 60% of the energy that we use is electricity compared to 20% today. And the rest 40% has to be clean molecules. So that's kind of like a transition of how much electrons and how much molecule we need overall. If you take that to the storage side, yes, cost has been falling, but we're seeing the same trend we're seeing on PV, which is the balance of plant is the majority of the cost, not the PV panels or the cells in the battery. So there's a limit at how low it can go. Duration, you can do, it has a possibility to go beyond 8 hours. You got 12 hours, some would say, as we get into solid state battery, and that has a significant opportunity for higher energy density. We can go in the days, and days is, that's not near term, that's in the next 10, 15 years, but that's days, that's not a week, and that's not a month, and that's not a season. So I would say days is where solid state will take us. And could there be some other innovative breakthrough on lithium ion, on other chemistries? Sure, there can be. And this is where I think we need to make sure we are putting bet on all technologies, because storage, short term, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12 hours, and storage long term, days, seasons, are the two most needed technology for us to decarbonize the economy.
Do any of the other panelists have a comment they'd like to make on that before we go to the next question? Okay. And then again, from the floor in Geneva, a question from Hossein Ameli. Hossein?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Jim, for this. This is Hossein Ameli from Imperial College London. My question is for Mr. Lewandowski. I have two questions regarding the future of nuclears and SMRs. First of all, what's your opinion in terms of the cost efficiency and waste? Because as you know, we have many other options, flexible options to complement the renewables. For example, gas plants running by hydrogen, which, as you know, Siemens has a plan for 2030 to have gas plants running 100% by hydrogen, and also having gas plants combined with CCUS. So how can you compare these in this matter? And I have also a second question, which is, can you comment on how we can make the existing nuclear plants more flexible to kind of, in terms of from techno-economic perspectives? Thank you.
Merci pour votre question sur les deux sujets que vous évoquez, évidemment, deux points différents. Sur la première question, évidemment, sur les SMR, aujourd'hui, nous le savons tous, le Saint Graal du SMR, le SMR idéal qui recyclerait lui-même ses propres déchets, la 4e génération, nous ne l'avons pas trouvé, et donc nous heurterons aux mêmes difficultés que celles que nous connaissons déjà aujourd'hui, mais difficultés auxquelles nous savons apporter des premières réponses. Et donc par rapport à la question des déchets, qui est tout à fait fondamentale, vous avez raison, je pense que nous aurons à la fois une combinaison de recyclage, d'entreposage et de stockage de la même manière que celle que nous connaissons aujourd'hui. En revanche, nous espérons que demain, bien évidemment, parce qu'on aura affaire à des outils encore plus performants, nous aurons moins de matière à recycler. C'est une des promesses des SMR, et peut-être encore plus loin, mais là nous partons à 20 ou 30 ans. Évidemment, tout ceci peut-être nous mènera vers une 4e génération sans déchets. Mais nous n'y sommes pas encore, c'est évident. Et dans l'échelle de temps que vous évoquiez, c'est-à-dire à 2030, je ne vois pas, mais peut-être ai-je tort, mais je ne vois pas de révolution qui permettrait d'être totalement confiant dans l'idée que nous aurions un système de recyclage intégré. Sur la question de la flexibilité, là, c'est un sujet que nous travaillons à EDF, en tout cas depuis très longtemps, puisque la plupart de nos 56 réacteurs sont en capacité d'assurer une flexibilité de 100% à 20% en 30 minutes. C'est ce que j'évoquais rapidement tout à l'heure. Et donc, une capacité d'insertion dans un marché qui est tous les jours plus complexe, on le sait, avec la part des intermittentes, qui est des énergies intermittentes, qui nous conduit à devoir de plus en plus moduler, assurer cette modularité. Alors c'est un énorme travail, et il va de soi que notre volonté est que les produits futurs, du nucléaire futur, que ce soit le programme EPR, qui est effectivement en cours aujourd'hui, ou le programme des SMR, a dans son cahier des charges cette question absolument clé de la flexibilité. Donc aujourd'hui, nous continuons à travailler dans ce domaine-là, et avec de bons espoirs au regard de ce que nous assurons déjà avec le parc existant.
Thank you. Pedro, I know you've had a lot of experience. Edison has had experience in this area, and I see you have your hand raised. So I'd love for you to comment as well.
I would just like to emphasize one of the points around the storage of spent fuel. That is a critical part of the equation. It's one where I think countries like France have advanced much further. In the United States, it is an issue that still needs to be solved. And it's a classic place where I actually think we have much of the technology needed, but we need stronger policy to develop a national level depository for spent fuel. So it's one of the things that our company has been advocating in Washington very strongly. And it's not just developing a consolidated site, whether it's permanent or an interim site, but developing this whole supply chain to be able to move the fuel to safe storage for the long term at a single or small number of sites, as opposed to the issue we have today, where you have spent fuel storage at each of over 100 sites across the country. So that's where I think the United States can learn from other countries, particularly in terms of having the policy resolve to deploy the technology.
And I think I recall from an earlier conversation, you told me that nuclear development in California is illegal until that issue is resolved.
It is. There is state law that does not allow development of new nuclear until the federal government, the national level, fulfills its commitment. It has a legal commitment to deploy centralized storage.
Great, thank you. Dr. Zherenchinov, it looks like your hand is up. Is that correct?
Да, я бы хотел задать вопрос господину Левандовскому. Сейчас в Китае активно экспериментируют с технологиями ядерного синтеза на основе тория. Значит, основной отличительной особенностью данных технологий является очень низкое водопотребление. Казахстан, как страна, являющаяся вододефицитной, интересуется этими технологиями. Господин Левандовский, скажите, пожалуйста, считаете ли вы эти технологии возможными для широкого промышленного применения? Я говорю о ториевом ядерном реакторе. Спасибо большое.
Malheureusement, la traduction n'a pas réussi à capter ce que vous disiez, la technologie que vous évoquiez.
Ядерный реактор в Китае, эксперименты, они применяют ядерное топливо в виде элемент торий.
En tant qu'élément de thorium. Si c'est la partie thorium, on ne regarde pas.
Alors, je ne suis pas certain, je suis vraiment désolé d'avoir compris la question. Si vous parlez de réacteurs utilisant du thorium, clairement, ce sujet-là n'est pas... c'est bien ça. Ce sujet-là, clairement, est un sujet que nous n'avons pas étudié et que nous n'étudions pas aujourd'hui. On reste sur nos technologies habituelles à ce stade, que ce soit d'ailleurs pour les EPR ou pour les technologies de SMR.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, Arshad, I know you have a robust nuclear program at EPRI. Do you have anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
Just two quick. One was the first question on existing nuclear. How do you do flexibility? Typically flexibility, like the French fleet, they can go up and down when the load following matter. What we're seeing now is in US and other places, there's another way to get flexibility. We have several projects where nuclear power plants are putting electrolyzers co-located with nuclear power plants. So when electricity is not needed, you're producing another energy carrier like hydrogen, and that gives you flexibility. So that's one. And second, I think there is tremendous excitement in advanced nuclear. Both thorium, looking at molten salt, and there is significant private and public funding that is going on. And we firmly believe before this decade is over, we will have commercially operational, even micro reactors. These are in the 5 to 10 megawatt scale. So I think while many countries will deploy the large nuclear plants, the EPRs, the advanced light water reactors, but we see opportunities in the 30s and 40s where small modular and different chemistry than just advanced light water reactor will happen, and we'll have those tools in the toolbox.
Terrific, thank you. I think we're going to have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions, and we have one from the chair of the committee, Mr. Kindhorst. I will cede the floor to you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's quite interesting and exciting to see all the enthusiasm about the technologies and the options with the technologies. What I would like to try is to bridge a little bit the situation with the Western part of our UNECE region and the Eastern part. So we have heard that in California, there's the intention to spend more than 100 billion US dollar in the next years for investments. We have heard from France just for retrofitting and lifetime prolongation for nuclear power plants, 4 billion per year. And I see the situation in the Eastern hemisphere. So takes example of Ukraine, takes example maybe of Kazakhstan, where it's difficult even to mobilize the investments for maybe 10 billion US dollar. And so this is quite challenging and a different situation. And my question, as a colleague from Kazakhstan mentioned, the role of carbon markets. And this morning we discussed intensively the role of carbon pricing, especially to colleagues, panelists from California, but also from France. What opportunities they see from their side in these markets. And from their perspective, wouldn't it make it even more sense to spend a little share of what is intended to be spent in California, for example, in Kazakhstan, where there is an extreme potential to reduce the carbon footprint as a global problem. So you see, I referred to the Paris Agreement and its Article 6, allowing perspectively for such an implementation of activities not in the only in the own country, but also to do it at places where the carbon costs and the reduction of carbon costs is lower. So that's partly a political question, but at the end, everything will be implemented by the companies, and therefore I would be very interested in your views in this regard.
So that's a terrific question. Who would like to start? Pedro.
Great. No, that is an outstanding question. And I think that as you implied in the question, there are economic factors, there are also political factors in this. As a rule, in general, we believe in markets. And so for me, the ideal outcome would be one where government sets a broad policy around decarbonization and then uses market forces to the greatest extent possible to let the economy sort out what the most effective technologies are and in what time frame. Now, that's economic nirvana. That is not typically political reality. And so in our state, we have seen the use of a carbon market for parts of the economy, not for the entire economy. And so, and I will be very candid and say that there was an attempt, for example, a few years ago to broaden the state's carbon trading market, which is very, very robust and is connected with a number of other jurisdictions, to broaden that to more sectors of the economy, including transportation. But there was a very strong political push in the state's capital, mounted largely by oil companies and some transportation companies, that ultimately led to rejecting that expansion of the market. There may be opportunities to broaden that again in the future. I think there is a discussion at the US federal level in Washington, DC, about whether a carbon market or carbon pricing should be part of the ultimate solution. In general, I think that some component of that would be valuable. And in fact, the limited market we have in California today has allowed a minority of the reductions to come in from out-of-state offsets, because we all recognize that carbon dioxide molecules mix within 30 days across the global atmosphere. So that is truly a global issue. One final point, though, going back to politics, all politics are local. And we need to remember that there are other parts of the equation where the investments get made, where the jobs get developed, and some of the collateral advantages of decarbonization. For example, when you decarbonize transportation, it not only reduces global carbon, but it also reduces local air pollution, local air emissions. And so from an environmental justice perspective, we do see many of our disadvantaged communities opposing carbon markets because they worry that not enough of the investment and the collateral improvements will happen in the local communities. So there's a balance there someplace. I think carbon pricing should be part of the equation, but it will have limits to it, I think, locally.
Your terrific perspective. Other panelists like to make a comment on the role of carbon markets globally? Dr. Yurenchinov?
Спасибо, господин Роб, за предоставленную возможность. Я скажу, что в Казахстане есть четкая политическая воля по соблюдению Парижских соглашений. И нам необходимо, как абсолютно правильно сказал председатель, найти источники финансирования этих сложных и дорогих процессов. Мы считаем, что первичный рынок углеродных единиц позволит Государственному углеродному фонду саккумулировать средства для направления его на конкретные проекты в промышленности, которые позволят снизить углеродный след выпускаемой ими продукции. Мы считаем, что это наиболее реалистичный подход к решению этих проблем. И интеграция системы торговли выбросов Казахстана и системы торговли выбросов Европейского Союза послужит основой для рыночных элементов, методов регулирования цены на углеродные единицы и прозрачности процессов инвестиционных в промышленности. Спасибо.
Terrific, thank you. Bashir Lezadowski or Arshad, anything you'd like to add? Then we'll take one more question and have to wrap up.
Oui, enfin, au regard de ce qui vient d'être évoqué, peut-être 2 ou 3 commentaires. Le premier, rappeler qu'effectivement, j'évoquais 4 milliards d'euros par an, 4 milliards d'investissements pour prolonger la durée de vie du parc existant à l'échelle de 56 réacteurs, évidemment, et ce sur une période de 10 à 15 ans. Je tiens à rassurer nos auditeurs, clairement, il s'agit d'un programme qui est économiquement extrêmement rentable. Il y a là une base économique et qui intéresse particulièrement votre commission, qui est vertueuse et positive. Alors, par rapport à la question du président, est-ce que c'est un sujet notamment qu'on pourrait travailler avec des pays en développement ou des pays, des puissances moyennes? Pour ce qui est du nucléaire, il y a au moins 2 sujets qui doivent être intégrés dans la réflexion, indépendamment des messages qu'enverrait évidemment un prix du CO2 sur le marché spécifique. Les 2 points qui me paraissent essentiels, le premier, c'est évidemment une vraie décision politique. Le nucléaire reste un produit politique qui permet des investissements de long terme. J'y reviens, je l'ai évoqué tout à l'heure, mais faire des contrats de long terme est la seule manière d'intéresser durablement des investisseurs. Et donc, ces fondamentaux économiques sont d'abord et avant tout liés à une politique de long terme et à des investissements de long terme. Et puis, il y a un deuxième sujet qui est tout aussi important, qui est plus industriel que de l'ordre de la science économique, mais tout se tient, c'est évidemment, on ne construit pas de nucléaire sans une base industrielle extrêmement forte. Et donc, avant de promouvoir du nucléaire dans un certain nombre de puissances moyennes, il faut d'abord s'assurer que nous disposons d'un volume, une base industrielle dans tous les métiers, de l'ingénierie jusqu'au soudeur ou au tuyauteur, qui soit en capacité de faire vivre cet appareil. Donc le contexte économique, l'environnement économique d'un produit comme le nucléaire dépasse le marché carbone et elle doit intégrer la nécessité d'investissement long terme parce que le coût du capital est élevé, incontestablement, sur ce genre d'opération, et une base industrielle très solide.
Terrific. We have one last question that we'll try to work through quickly, and then we'll wrap up. And this question comes from Marco Gas.
Thank you very much. I am Manuel Cox from Marco Gas. I have one comment and one question. I will start with my comment. I think that we are creating a kind of culture of electrification. In my view, what is important is sustainability, energy efficiency, and reduction of emissions. Electrification is using electricity is an end product, is a kind of energy that is used, but whatever kind of energy we use to satisfy the life of the humans, I think it has to be considered from the technical point of view. So looking at the crossroad where we are today, and we don't know many of the solutions that we should have for the future of decarbonized energy systems, electrification itself, I think, it's not the right way to look to the decarbonization of today, because technology is open to many different solutions. For example, the use of coal, of course, today when someone talks about coal, it is practically a sin. But if you are using a coal and you are assuring that you have sustainability, energy efficiency, and you are not emitting because you are capturing and storing the carbon, then what is the point? If you are using natural gas and you are assuring that you are not making emissions and you are sustainable and you are applying energy efficiency, and then what is the point? So talking about electrification itself, use of electricity, I think is that a kind of myth or a culture we are creating, because when one of the speakers was talking about electrical cars, that's fine, the car is charging with electricity, but at which extent is the battery that is being used in the car is sustainable? There are many technologies of batteries, so nobody's talking about all the value, all the chain on, I think, okay. Nobody's talking about all the chain where from the very starting point to the end point. It is the same when we are using the windmills, let's say the renewable energy from the wind. That is renewable, but at which extent is the material used to produce the windmill is renewable? So this is my comment. I think that we are at the point where we need to be open for technologies, and the objective is to assure that sustainability, energy efficiency, and no emissions are taken into consideration. So this is my comment. In regard to the question, today we have the electricity systems, we have the gas systems, and the history behind the construction of these very long distance systems is that there was decentralized generation. Today, we are seeing that in the future, there will be a lot of decentralization. My question to the panelists is, at which extent do you envisage, because we need visionaries, at which extent you envisage that the electricity system and the gas system based on the sector integration will be used or coupled or dealt simultaneously? And what is your view for what has been already put in place in terms of investment in these two kinds of systems? Thank you very much.
That was a terrific comment, observation, and questions. I have lost my ability to see the panelists. So if anybody would like to comment, I'll just invite you to jump in. Otherwise, we're going to need to turn this back to the chair for the next session. So, but I can't call on anybody. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm not hearing any comments, so we'll leave this at this point with more to come. We're clearly out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time with us today and sharing their insights with us, and for the committee for the honor of being allowed to form and chair this panel. It's been insightful. I've learned a lot. I hope you've all learned a lot, and I know this will make a contribution to our work at UNECE on sustainable energy development. So thank you all very much, and I'll now turn the floor back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you, panelists. I think as we had to open the last question, maybe there might be an option to get answers via the chat function or via the chair of this last panel, if you agree. So that was just related to the last point. We then continue also on the agenda item 7 with the last session on carbon capture, use and storage. And we have for this session this afternoon for introductory remark our executive Secretary, Mr. Alioyorova. For that point, you have the floor before we continue with the moderation of this session. It's a great pleasure to have you here again this afternoon for this important topic, which already played an important role in the course of the meeting yesterday and this morning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, dear Jürgen. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my pleasure to be back with you at this 30th meeting of the Committee on Sustainable Energy to discuss this interesting topic, carbon capture, use and storage. UNECE has been raising awareness and building capacity on carbon capture, use and storage, or CCUS technologies across the UNECE region for several years. Back in 2014, UNECE submitted a position paper on CCUS to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, calling for policy parity with other low and no carbon technologies. Since then, many regional capacity building workshops have taken place and tools have been developed. I can just mention our recent technology brief on carbon capture, use and storage, and the in-depth analysis on CO2 storage capacity in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia. Tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary General is convening a UN high-level dialogue on energy. This is the first global gathering on energy mandated by the UN General Assembly since 1981. It will give all UN member states an opportunity to demonstrate their commitments to meet Paris Agreement targets. I will gather with my fellow executive secretaries from the other 4 regional commissions in a side event to discuss the importance of scaling up carbon dioxide removal to achieve climate targets. So why is this important? Countries in the UNECE region need to cut or capture at least 90 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2050 to meet the Paris Agreement. Only international cooperation, innovation can deliver the necessary, accelerated and more ambitious strategies. If gaps are not addressed urgently, progressively more drastic and expensive measures will be required. Achieving carbon neutrality will require a holistic energy system approach and an all-technology strategy. Technology portfolios can be adapted by countries to reflect their unique circumstances, but I'm convinced that we have the technology and the capability to address this problem. Carbon removal technologies are crucial in this mission. They are critical and viable climate policy options in the UNECE region. Without CCUS, we will certainly not be able to meet our objectives. These technologies allow countries to establish a pathway to carbon neutrality, deliver on their emissions targets, and prepare for their net negative phase beyond 2050. Some sectors cannot be easily decarbonized, such as energy-intensive industries, production of cement, steel and iron, chemicals or glass, and long-haul transport. We need to continue investing into R&D to develop new technologies that could fully decarbonize our economies. Attaining carbon neutrality comprehensively will require rapid deployment of the following. First, high-performance building standards that promote green building materials, efficient management of methane emissions for production of low-carbon gases, clean hydrogen and synthetic fuels, effective management of carbon sinks, such as forests and oceans, to sustain our planet's natural carbon absorption capacity. We need to keep deforestation under control, encourage reforestation, and protect our oceans. Deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies combined with fossil as well as biomass energy sources to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, enhancing the uptake of direct air carbon capture and storage technology. We need solutions that deliver quality of life broadly. This means not only delivering on climate objectives, but also addressing the daily challenges of individuals who are the agents of change and who have their own priorities. We need to define what we mean by a fair energy transition. If we consider that greenhouse gases accumulate over long periods of time, then FAIR should consider how much has been emitted cumulatively since the 1800s as the developed world developed. The developing world should not sacrifice its own quality of life aspirations. That conversation misses an important point. Solutions can be opportunity-driven. Helping countries develop sustainably means investing in infrastructure, in technology, and in employment. The high-level dialogue on energy and COP26 provides unique opportunities for the world to realize that effective solutions are within reach. We must be pragmatic and recognize that there is not just a single universal answer. What matters is the collective outcome. We must deliver on the climate agenda while delivering on the quality of life agenda globally. Governments and politicians must be empowered to act. We should expect that governments are acting to improve our quality of life. We should expect that governments will act rationally and holistically in terms of economics, environment, and society. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to the outcomes of this panel. I also invite you to join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Geneva time for an online discussion of 5 UN regional commissions on the role of carbon dioxide removal at this year's high-level dialogue on energy. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Executive Secretary, for setting the scene, and Olga, all success for the virtual meeting tomorrow in New York. With this, I would like to hand over to Jared Daniels, our Vice Chair in the Committee on Sustainable Energy. I also would like to take this opportunity, as he is leaving the Bureau, to thank him for all his commitment over the last years and contributing to our work. Jared, all the best, and you have the floor for the next session and the moderation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for those kind words. And Olga, thank you for wonderfully setting the scene for our discussion here today. This session will explore the importance of action on carbon capture, use, and storage for attainment of the objectives of the Paris Agreement in a context of delivering on the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development, as Olga mentioned. The ECE has an ongoing program on carbon neutrality that is exploring approaches to achieving carbon neutrality in the electric sector and energy-intensive industries such as steel and cement. CCUS is one of these technologies that has been explored closely, and the results of that work will be featured in our conversation today. CCUS also has an essential role to enable carbon dioxide removal to be potential in the time frame and scale required to help meet our sustainable development goals. And we just heard in the previous session on electricity sector about the enormity of the scale and the urgency required to advance all forms of clean energy technology deployment and the role that CCUS can play. This session will explore broad policy and business model frameworks for CCUS with connections to the earlier discussions on carbon markets and pricing from a session earlier this morning, and will provide some specific examples of how CCUS can enable in market conditions and given individual social contexts and demands. The outcomes for this session are expected to improve the understanding across our member states on the opportunities presented by CCUS and the barriers facing its broad deployment. And finally, the session aims to support a call for action from our member states to deploy CCUS at scale and for the UNECE to extend its analysis of CCUS broadly. Given Olga already set the seed wonderfully, I think we'll now turn to our keynote address, followed by an expert panel discussion to close our session. So in terms of our keynote address, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy. And she was previously the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. As a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, she led WRI's carbon removal program. Dr. Wilcox's work focuses on minimizing the negative impacts of humankind on our natural environment. She holds a PhD in chemical engineering, a master's degree in chemistry, and a bachelor's degree in mathematics. Dr. Wilcox's research takes aim at the nexus of energy and the environment, developing both mitigation and adaptation strategies to minimize negative climate impacts associated with society's dependence on fossil fuels. She served on committees of the National Academy of Science, the American Physics Society, to assess carbon capture methods and impacts on climate. She's the author of the first textbook on carbon capture, published nearly a decade ago in 2012, and more recently, she co-edited the widely available CDR primer on carbon dioxide removal in 2021. So with that as a brief introduction, Dr. Wilcox, the floor and our attention are yours.
Thank you so much, Jared, for having me here today. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to join you today by video to talk about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing to combat climate change, and in doing so, meet the obligations set out by the Paris Agreement. As you all know, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently released its sixth assessment report, and the news is disturbing. Absent deep cuts in carbon dioxide emissions, average global temperatures will exceed 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. The extreme weather we've been seeing this year here in North America and in Europe, where you just had your warmest summer on record, is only the most recent example showing the scale of the problem. Clearly, we have a shrinking window of opportunity to limit the harm done to our most vulnerable climate populations. In 2019, global CO2 emissions from fossil fuels reached 33 billion metric tons. We clearly have work to do together. And for its part, the Biden administration's mission is clear. With the help of technology and incentives, the US economy aims to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, to produce 100% clean electricity by 2035, and to ultimately reach a net zero US carbon economy by 2050. Decarbonization is a cornerstone of President Biden's strategy, which means we have to look at every sector of the economy, from energy to manufacturing to transportation and the service sector, to truly make a difference. And to put it in President Biden's words, we have an opportunity to build back better, to build and deploy these vital technologies in a better way than we've done previously. And that will stand the test of time in combating this global threat. The mission of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management revolves around investments in technology that ensures clean and affordable energy while helping ease the transition toward a net zero carbon future. And while we continue to rely on fossil fuels to meet our energy demands today, we're working toward minimizing their environmental impacts in addition to decarbonizing the existing infrastructure. And this will require carbon capture coupled to reliable and dedicated carbon storage. And to this end, the Department of Energy's budget request for next year is asking for a 60% increase in federal investment in research and development for carbon capture, storage, conversion, and removal, up to $368 million in 2022. And in the past 5 years, the Department of Energy has spent $1.2 billion toward the advancement of various carbon management strategies. First, I want to touch on carbon capture. Capturing carbon dioxide at the source of its emission, also known as point source carbon capture. For the past 2 decades, we've focused on carbon capture technology investments in the power sector, with a particular focus on coal-fired power plants. Going forward, we want to expand our efforts to capturing carbon emissions from committed infrastructure that's expected to persist through mid-century, like natural gas-fired power plants, and harder to decarbonize industrial sectors, like hydrogen, cement, and steel production. Earlier this year, the Department of Energy made available $75 million for R&D and front-end engineering design studies for carbon capture specifically to the natural gas power sector and industrial sectors. And after capturing CO2, it has to further be managed towards storage to ensure that it doesn't re-enter the atmosphere. Some products can lock CO2 away permanently, like carbonate rocks, which can be used as feedstocks for building and construction. But other products, like synthetic fuels, can lock CO2 away, but just temporarily. But they also come with the benefit of lessening our reliance on crude oil extraction and refining to make these same products. In addition, for producing synthetic fuels and chemicals with CO2 as a feedstock, sourcing low carbon hydrogen will be critical. And there's significant potential in applying carbon capture to help advance a cost-effective and low carbon hydrogen economy. In fact, one of our 4 major demonstration projects with CCS is in Port Arthur, Texas, successfully combines carbon capture with steam methane reforming to produce hydrogen. And for a single production stream, the project captures over 90% of the CO2 for clean hydrogen production. And this project has actually been injecting over 7 million tons of CO2 deep underground since 2013. So we know how to do this, but we need to act more quickly and we need to think more broadly. We also need to think about supply chains. The natural gas that goes into steam methane reforming, for instance, is not leak tight today. In general, when we examine fossil fuel extraction, whether it's coal, oil, or natural gas, we have to recognize that there are methane emissions associated with these resources. And this is why we're also investing in approaches to reduce methane leakage associated with fossil fuel production and its transport, such as natural gas pipelines, gathering facilities, and also when it applies to oil production and abandoned and active coal mines. And this approach takes us beyond the idea of just drawing a box around the unit that emits the carbon. We need to draw the box much larger to include the supply chains that go into these units, whether we're producing energy or making a product. And what we're looking at is stacking a number of approaches together to achieve deep decarbonization. Carbon capture will play an essential part of this effort, and we can leverage data from the increasing number of investments that we've made, from CCS on coal, the CCS associated with blue hydrogen that I mentioned, and then we can actually use these to expand and have greater impact throughout the industrial sector. But it's clear that to achieve net zero, we will need carbon dioxide removal as well, to remove CO2 from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere that's been growing since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that's where our Department of Energy's Direct Air Capture Initiative is playing an important role. If this were a decade or more ago, we could have perhaps focused just on deep decarbonization, but we're in a place where it's simply too late for that. We now need to start taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. which really involves the legacy emissions associated with our dependence on fossil fuels. Because carbon dioxide removal takes CO2 out of the air, which is more than 100 times dilute compared to point sources, the process is ultimately more expensive, and it can also use more of Earth's limited energy sources, energy like low carbon energy, but also land, and in some cases, water as well. So for this reason, we want to be responsible in ensuring that carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere is not used to simply offset emissions that can be avoided today, such as decarbonizing fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide removal should be decoupled from fossil fuel industries and used to offset the truly hard to abate sectors today. These may include the agricultural sector, some parts of shipping and aviation. And in our office, we're leveraging our expertise in carbon capture to invest in direct air capture approaches using chemicals, minerals, and even biological systems to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. At the same time, secure and reliable CO2 storage is critical to helping us meet our climate goals. And we want to focus on improving storage and operational efficiency, improve our understanding of overall cost, and de-risk strategies to reduce these costs. And these are all critical elements to enabling and supporting a CCS industry that's safe, economically viable, and environmentally responsible. Our ultimate goal is to broaden the availability of certified resources for geologic storage in regions that have known storage capacity, but also in areas where the storage resource potential is more prospective. And we aim to expand carbon storage demonstration to have more projects distributed across the United States and in locations where CO2 injection deep underground is feasible today. And back in 2012, I wrote the first textbook specifically on carbon capture. And since then, there's been a lot of creativity and invention regarding carbon capture technologies. Yet emissions globally have grown almost every year since. So our mission and the work required to achieve it is more urgent than ever. This is why what the Committee on Sustainable Energy is doing to support carbon capture investment and what the 56 member countries, large and small, that are part of the UN Economic Commission for Europe are doing to help solve climate change is so important. We have very little time left to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. The climate crisis threatens our people, our communities, public health, and economy. And to be even more direct, our ability to live on planet Earth. Today, with non-governmental organizations around the world and individuals on their own, our nations have met great challenges in the past, and when it comes to making the environment safer and healthier. So I want to just thank you again for inviting me to share my message with you today. And I look forward to leveraging our collective expertise, passion, and drive to achieve greater impact in this space. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox, very much for those words and for joining us today. It's clear from what you've mentioned that the U.S. is leading with science-based programs and actions, and I think we heard that loud and clear from you today. It's also crystal clear that we need to take a total systems view across all of these technology aspects and policy considerations. I think you've made that clear as well. And finally, I think your remark that we all need to find a way to work together to meet our common goals, and there is certainly urgency in the action required. So thank you again for providing the keynote and setting our conversation for the rest of this session. Much appreciated. We'll now turn to our panel session. We've got 4 panelists to lead off our discussion, and then hopefully we'll have some robust and healthy conversation after some opening presentations. First up will be a colleague from the IEA, Ms. Samantha McCullough, who's head of the Carbon Capture Utilization and Storage Unit in Fatih Birol's organization there. She'll be followed by Dr. Roger Ains, who's the chief scientist for the energy program at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. After Sam and Roger give their remarks, we'll hear from Sergei Kadyshev, who's vice chair of the group of experts on clean air electricity systems and from Kazakhstan's perspective. And we'll also then hear from a UK perspective with Ms. Brioni Livesey, who's with the Industrial Decarbonization Challenge in the UK. So hopefully we'll get a broad perspective both from outside the ECE family and from several countries along the continuum within the ECE family. So with that as just an opening lead for the panel session, Samantha, please start us off.
Well, thank you so much, Jared, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I think that was already a really fantastic start to this discussion from Dr. Wilcox, really setting out why this is an important conversation to be having and why CCUS is important for meeting climate goals. So what I wanted to do, just to provide some sort of introductory remarks, is focus on some analysis from the International Energy Agency in terms of how we see the role of CCUS in supporting net zero goals. Next slide, please. Just to provide some context, many will appreciate and understand that CCUS technologies are not necessarily new. Some projects have been operating since the 1970s and 1980s, principally in the United States. And many of these projects have been associated with natural gas processing. So this is shown in the light blue in the slide, recognizing that this is a relatively low cost application for CCUS. And indeed, in many cases, the CO2 needs to be taken out of the reservoir gas in any event. But you can see just in the last decade, so since 2010, there's been a substantial expansion in terms of the global experience with CCUS. So not only are we capturing more CO2 these days, so we have capacity to capture more than 40 million tonnes a year, but our experience with CCUS applications has really expanded. So we now have projects operating around the world that are applying CCUS to hydrogen, which Dr. Wilcox just mentioned, to steel plants, bioethanol, power generation, synthetic fuels, etc. So this provides an important foundation really to develop and grow CCUS as part of our portfolio of technologies that we need to meet climate goals. Next slide, please. So now I just want to touch on what this role of CCUS could look like from a global perspective in climate pathways. So earlier this year in May, the International Energy Agency released a flagship report which sought to provide a roadmap for the global energy sector to reach net zero by 2050. This really recognised that more and more governments and countries are committing to net zero goals, principally around mid-century, but some are slightly earlier, some are a bit later, but not necessarily with a detailed understanding yet of what would really be required to achieve these goals. So what we sought to do with this analysis was really to provide some detail around the scale of the transformation that would be required. Of course, this is not the pathway to get to net zero emissions. It's a pathway, and we hope a useful tool for policymakers. But I wanted to make the point that here such a transition will come with many milestones, and here on this slide I'm highlighting a few of those milestones. These are around technology innovation, technology development for policy, and indeed in our report we have around 400 milestones identified. But just to highlight in particular the CCUS milestones. So by 2035, more than 4 billion tonnes of CO2 is captured globally. So that's from around that 40 million tonnes that we have today. And then by 2050, more than 7.6 billion tonnes of CO2 are captured. So this is a very, very significant scale up, obviously, of CCUS. But just to try to put that in some context, it really reflects the scale of the transformation that's needed across all technologies. So there's a heavy lift for CCUS, but also for other technologies. So just to provide some additional numbers and context around this, just for example, by 2030, energy efficiency improvements would need to be implemented 3 times faster than we've seen in the past 2 decades. For solar and wind, which obviously play a very important role in energy transitions, these would need to be installed at 4 times the record that was set in 2020. And electric vehicles would go from around 5% of car sales today to 60% of car sales by 2030. So that's just to provide some sort of context in terms of the scale of the transformation. Next slide, please. But looking sort of specifically at the scale up for CCUS, so we need really an immediate acceleration in terms of the rollout of projects, reaching almost 1.7 billion tonnes of CO2 being captured by the end of this decade, by 2030. So in our analysis, we apply CCUS in virtually all parts of the energy sector. So CCUS is applied in fuel transformation, for power generation, for heavy industry, so steel, cement, chemicals. And we also have technologies such as direct air capture emerging in this period to 2030. So in the period post 2030, the scale up is very much focused on a growth in terms of capture around heavy industry. So again, the steel, cement, chemicals, where CCUS is one of the few options that we have for deep emissions reductions. There's also a very strong role here for low carbon hydrogen production, so CCUS equipped hydrogen production, which again plays an important role in the energy transition. In the period to 2050, we also see a growing role, particularly for carbon removal. So Dr. Wilcox already touched on the importance of carbon removal, but particularly bioenergy with CCUS or BECCS technologies and direct air capture are capturing around 2.4 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions by 2050. While most of this CO2 that's captured is permanently stored, there is also a role for CO2 use. So around 500 million tonnes of CO2 is used, for example, to produce synthetic aviation fuels in our pathway by 2050. So while we're not on track yet for this type of scale of deployment of CCUS, I wanted to just highlight that we do see very significant momentum and project activity around CCUS currently, just in the last few years. And I would cite the expansion of the 45Q tax credit in the United States as being one of the key kind of moments that's really been an impetus for this momentum that we're seeing now for CCUS. But particularly climate goals, so net zero goals, and this growing appreciation that CCUS will indeed be needed to meet net zero goals, as well as an improved investment environment, are really driving this momentum that we're seeing. And just based on our tracking, we're seeing at least one project a week being announced so far in 2021. So more than 40 projects have been announced this year. So it's a very significant scale up from what we've seen in previous years. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the discussion and happy to answer questions. Thanks, Jared.
Great. I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much, Sam, for showing us those slides, giving us the global perspective. And again, I think you touched on many of the issues that hopefully we'll continue to have good conversation on as we move through our panel in terms of not just the technology issues, the policy issues, some of the mechanisms that may be appropriate given individual country context, and again, the enormity of the scale in which we're talking about. So thank you for starting off our discussion well.
We seem to have lost Jared briefly. He did say he was having network problems. He did ask me to step in just in case. So I don't have the clever things in mind that he was going to say, but I know he was in the process of introducing Roger Ains on the role of CCS in implementing net zero industry. If I could then turn the floor to Roger, if you could pick up the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Guide the first slide. I'm going to talk briefly about the role of CCUS in US emissions, which in industrial emissions have not declined much recently. Even with the great replacement of coal in the United States, our overall emissions have not changed. And that's a challenge for us. What that says is, despite a significant energy transformation, we're not decreasing our emissions. Next slide. And this slide from Rhodium Group demonstrates one of the important reasons why. Industrial emissions are incredibly complex. They come from the power that's used to make the products. They come from the actual products themselves, the best example being cement, where CO2 is emitted by the product as it's created. And they come in the form of a lot of other greenhouse gases besides CO2, methane, but as you can see here, nitrous oxide is an important emission. So controlling emissions from industry is not a simple one-step process. We can't say there's a single silver bullet that's going to resolve industry for us. And we have to keep a very broad spectrum. I like to say we have to have a big tent of solutions that we're going to include for getting this done. And the next slide. And carbon capture and storage represent two important elements here. The first is the control of point sources of concentrated CO2 that are coming from the power creation and from, especially in the case of cement, but also in the case of steel, the process emissions themselves. So rather than emitting those, we can use CCS to capture those on the existing processes. And as Dr. Wilcox mentioned, we're going to have to make up for many of those other small and sometimes supply chain emissions by carbon dioxide removal. And when an industry or a business considers its goal in net zero, they consider their supply chain as well. And they often have very little control over that supply chain. So we're finding that for individual businesses reaching net zero, the use of carbon capture and storage for cleaning up the atmosphere, for carbon dioxide removal, is going to be a very important part of their strategy. But this is only part of the overall industrial strategy. And we don't want to imply that CCUS is the answer for industry. We need better electrical heating. Heat is a big source of industrial emissions. We need to use electrochemistry to make chemicals instead of starting with fossil fuels. And certainly the creation of synthetic fuels and biofuels is going to help reduce the intensity of the liquid fuels that we do need. And many of these things rely on offsets. And so this is an important place for international cooperation to make sure that those offsets are indeed appropriate and accurately used. Can I have the final slide? And I believe that industry will welcome policy action. They're looking forward to this. Many industry groups have put out goals of net zero, and they understand that this is an international effort. It's going to take cooperation. It's going to take investment. It's going to take building of infrastructure to store the CO2, to capture the CO2. These are things that have to be done on an international scale. Many times the best opportunities to do these things are not within the boundaries of one country, but have to be shared among nations. Standards for what constitutes a clean product in this have to be international. And that is an immediate opportunity to say, what constitutes a clean product? What constitutes net zero? And this final thing that is I think, going to be coming to the head over the next few years is that as we have these ambitions, people are going to be saying, I have a net zero plan, and we need to have international standards for what those are. And offsets in particular are something that are susceptible to bad math. And we need to be very careful of that. And international cooperation to refine that is going to be critical. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're going to save any questions we may have for both Roger and Sam till the end. Jared, are you back with us, or are you having some issues?
Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Yep. So thank you, Roger, and thank you, Sam. I apologize for any internet connections problems I may have. But yes, Roger, I think it would be most appreciated by all of us, and in fact, all of humanity, if we based our policy decisions and platforms on good math, not bad math. And I think there's enormous challenges in doing that and making sure that we draw the boxes correctly and do the life cycle analysis correctly. And again, that good math forms the basis for policy conversation. I think that's one of the nice things about the UNECE family and platform here is that we can champion good math supported robust policy conversations. Again, realizing that every country situation is unique, but there are many things we can all collaborate on and we must collaborate on and work together for a common global solution. So thank you for your words of wisdom there. We'll now turn to Sergey, who will provide a perspective perhaps from his vice chair role and also from Kazakhstan perspective as well. Please, Sergey.
Спасибо, господин председатель. В предыдущей сессии очень хорошо и глубоко Казахстан был представлен, поэтому я постараюсь коротко выступить. Все-таки несколько фактов еще указать. Казахстан территория огромная, 2,8 миллиона квадратных километров, всего 17 миллионов жителей, и страна входит в десятку тех стран, у которых избыток энергетических и минеральных ресурсов. И если говорить только об минеральных и энергетических ресурсах, то 0,5% мировых ресурсов запасов в Казахстане, это эквивалент 90 биллионов тонн нефтяного эквивалента, 70% из них приходится на уголь, 22% на нефть и 8% на газ. 62% территории имеет запас нефти и газа, но это в основном запад и юго-запад страны. Угольные запасы 3% от мировых. В год производства может составлять 162 миллиона тонн. Геологические запасы порядка 170 биллионов тонн, а балансовые 38-39 биллионов тонн. Запасы в основном в центре и на северо-востоке страны. Соответственно, строилась и энергетика, в частности электроэнергетика, а если говорить о эмиссии парникового газа, то 90% приходится на энергетическую активность, большинство из которых электроэнергетика. Электроэнергетика, ее специфические особенности в Казахстане таковы, что она крупная, она у нас третья среди стран бывшего Советского Союза после России и Украины, порядка 20 гигаватт полагаемой мощности на сегодня, производство порядка 115 биллионов киловатт-часов, 70% из которых производится на угле. Высокая концентрация мощностей, порядка половины располагаемой мощности находится в одном регионе, это Экибастуз и Павлодар, где находятся основные угольные разрезы, то есть открытая добыча угля. Также надо сказать, что у нас очень развито производство совместной тепла и электроэнергии на электростанциях. 38 таких электростанций, 32 из которых находятся в городах, которые производят тепло и электроэнергию для индустрии, коммерческого сектора и для населения. То есть рядом с той индустрией, о которой уже говорилось, это металлургия, сталеплавильная, горнодобывающая индустрия. Соответственно, порядка больше 40% электроэнергии на этих станциях производится и больше 40% тепла в стране. Надо сказать, что вроде бы такое положение на сегодня, стратегия понятна. Развитие – это увеличение использования возобновляемых источников энергии, ядерная энергетика в будущем, это энергоэффективность как при производстве, так и при использовании энергоресурсов. Но ясно, что при том, что у нас такое использование угля на сегодня, и десятки тысяч людей работают как в угольной промышленности, так и в электроэнергетике, то от угля мы не откажемся еще долго и от производства электроэнергии на угле. Соответственно, применение технологии улавливания и хранения СО2 не конфликтует, да, со стратегией развития энергетики и в целом страны. Да. Понятно, что наличие большого, их 192 количества нефтяных и газовых месторождений тоже этому должно способствовать. И, наверное, при такой большой территории можно найти геологические формации, которые позволят хранить СО2. Однако вот я должен сказать, что в нулевые, то есть 2000-е, как мы говорим, нулевые годы, В Казахстан приезжало много представителей больших компаний, которые разрабатывали технологии УХУ для электростанций. И при их представлении было понятно, что удорожание, то есть большие капитальные затраты, большие эксплуатационные расходы, удорожание электроэнергии даже в условиях тех стран, где работают эти, штаб-квартиры этих больших компаний, это в 1,5 и более раз, а в наших условиях это в несколько раз удорожалась бы электроэнергия. Стало понятно, что мы не можем быть пионерами в этом деле, а мы можем быть только теми, кто потом воспользуется результатами исследований, развития этих технологий в развивающихся странах. Только тогда, когда они станут, что называется, доступными, коммерчески возможными в наших условиях, они могут быть нами применены. Соответственно, мы понимаем, что нужно международное сотрудничество, что мы должны обмениваться информацией, да, что мы должны проводить совместные исследования в том же Казахстане по возможным, формациям для хранения углерода. Но, однако, использование этих технологий возможно только тогда, когда они станут широко использоваться в развитых странах. Это, конечно, не ближайшее будущее, но, соответственно, с тем, что, как вы рассматриваете перспективу, так и Казахстан должен смотреть перспективу, когда, в какие года до 2060 года возможно будет применение этих технологий и у нас. То есть через международное сотрудничество, через обмен информацией, через рассмотрение всех исследований по развитию, демонстрации, по схемам стимулирования, это будет возможно и в нашей стране. Но, конечно, на мой взгляд, эти технологии должны получить такую же поддержку в развитых странах, как в свое время на начальном этапе получали поддержку возобновляемые источники энергии. Потому что они к нам пришли позже, сейчас мы их применяем, они еще у нас дороже, но мы уже их применяем. По тому же пути, наверное, пойдем и с этими технологиями, с технологиями улавливания и хранения углерода, видя, надеясь, что они будут поддержаны. Но должен сказать, что все-таки, на наш взгляд, эти технологии должны развиваться совместно с развитием технологий производства электроэнергии, чистых технологий производства электроэнергии на угле. Они не должны, эти исследования, останавливаться, технологии останавливаться, должны развиваться совместно. Наверное, на этом закончу.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sergey, for that nice overview from your country's perspective. It's clear that your approach is an all-of-the-above approach, wanting to deploy all forms of clean energy technologies from renewables, nuclear, CCUS as part of that. And again, realizing your large reserves of fossil energy aspects and the fact that, as it's important that in an energy transition that no one be left behind. You've got a lot of folks that are working and have good paying jobs in industry, and you want those to absolutely continue as we move toward sustainable development. That came through crystal clear from your remarks as well. So thank you for providing your perspective from Kazakhstan to add to our conversation here. I think what you mentioned in terms of finding business models
All right, we've actually lost Jared again. I'll give him a second here to come back.
Now we'll turn to the perspective from the UK. Brioni, please, the floor and our attention are yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm Bryony Lucy, and I lead something called the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge in the UK. As you may know, reaching net zero emissions by 2050 is being signed into law in the UK. And as part of that, of course, we must decarbonise industry. As we've already heard, that's a very difficult task. It requires, industry is a massive user of power and heat. Of course, many processes produce CO2 as part of the manufacturing process. And of course, crucially, it costs a lot to decarbonize industry, and it makes it very difficult to compete with products on the world stage. So the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge was established in the UK about 2 years ago to kickstart the decarbonisation of industrial clusters in the UK. So these industrial clusters are the areas of the UK with lots of traditional industries like steel, cement, power production, refineries, and so on. And they are all located around the coast of the UK because we want to be capturing CO2 and storing the CO2 offshore. So the clusters have been defined and they're very practical regions to start the decarbonisation process in the UK because it allows us to adopt a collaborative approach. So not just decarbonising one industry in a region, but actually introducing the infrastructure that the large industries need, but that other smaller industries can also start to think about and use as well. So we are very keen on this approach. We have our programme, which has over £200 million of public money, but that investment is more than matched by the industrial partners in the programme too. We try to make sure that all elements of the programme are integrated as well as we can, but every cluster that we're working with has a very strong focus on developing carbon capture and storage infrastructure. So that's the pipelines and the offshore storage and the carbon capture processes. And then they almost all have a very large element of hydrogen production and distribution at scale as well. So the hydrogen production is also involving CCS because we're planning to produce it from natural gas with a CCS process added. So within the programme, we have got the plan to decarbonise power production. We're going to be building new gas-fired power stations with CCS, hydrogen production also at scale that we can either put into the gas grid or use directly in industrial processes or to produce power. And then we have the development of capture processes for industry as well. And crucially, we try to maintain a focus also on what the public is going to find acceptable and useful. And we try to make sure that we share knowledge around the different partners in the programme as much as we can, because we believe that's the most effective way of getting the costs down and developing this technology. So we're very pleased that we have the opportunity to develop this programme, but basically, although we're spending a lot of money, this doesn't actually achieve decarbonisation of anything. This is just the engineering studies to decarbonise. But we're not worried that the studies are not going to go anywhere because the government has already announced the next £1 billion of investment in these industrial clusters. And it is government policy that at least 2 of them will be fully operational by the middle of this decade, with at least 4 of them fully operational by the end of the decade. So we're feeling that we have a very robust programme, and I think we're looking forward to talking to you more about that in the panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Bryony, for those thoughts. And again, I think crystal clear of some of the things that you mentioned. You know, clearly the focus on industrial decarbonization, hubs and clusters, and common infrastructure that can then help reduce the cost for other capture opportunities to plug into. I think that's an interesting business model for us to talk about. You also mentioned the tie-in to hydrogen production and what hydrogen may be able to do to help decarbonize our overall energy system. In the last session, we talked about it, and I believe Arshad Mansour from EPRI talked a little bit about the storage opportunities of hydrogen and how that can help decarbonize and provide, you know, capacity and help in the electricity system, but also to decarbonize other sectors of the economy as well. And so again, it ties back into what we heard from Dr. Wilcox and others about taking that systems perspective across all of our opportunities to decarbonize and meet our challenges, and what's the appropriate role for CCUS. I think it's interesting, maybe we can have conversation in terms of specific to a hydrogen approach, how that may lend a hand here. And again, it depends on each country's situation, what may be, you know, optimal. You also mentioned that, you're very keen to be aware of what is publicly acceptable or useful. I think that's an interesting question that we all in all of our countries and all our unique circumstances need to be very aware of. And again, not a one size fits all conversation in that regard either. And you finally mentioned that, this is absolutely going to be policy driven. And I think that brings us back to, one of the real values for the UNECE family here is we can help inform and drive policy conversation across our member states in terms of, what are well-informed data points, what's the right way to look at the trade-offs, pros and cons of all of these technologies, and again, help each of us determine in our own unique circumstances what policy choices based on good math, to use Roger's term, are most appropriate. So thank you for your opening comments here. I think this is a great, setting to hopefully a robust conversation. For those of you that are virtually joining us here, if you want to put in some questions for our panelists in the chat, please send those to everyone and our panelists can see those live and we can try to work those in. It's interesting, maybe to start the discussion, Roger and Sam, you just heard from sort of, two very different perspectives across the UNECE family. I didn't know, Roger, if you had any sort of thoughts or feedback from what you've heard from Sergey or Bryony in terms of, opportunities, things from your perspective in California that may be a good fit in their national circumstances, and perhaps just things that we could talk about as a group here for the next few minutes.
Well, I think California has had the opportunity to test some of these concepts and define the good and the bad, which is one of the reasons I end up emphasizing the math. But the transition that we look at has to be one that's based upon standards. And that's been very valuable for California, saying we're going to have standards for the emissions from our electric grid, and we're going to gradually decrease those. And that has proven to be a relatively robust approach in terms of trying to protect the jobs and people in transition, because you're not simply wiping out industries, you're saying that industry has to meet new standards. And that's been very useful.
Thank you, Roger. And again, I think, hearing the word standards is near and dear to the UNECE as, one of the foremost, standard setting bodies, something of keen interest. And again, I think we all agree that, and we heard from Sergey as well, that, right, having those standards, across countries that then enable folks to work together with clearly identified, rules that everybody, can see transparently and strategically plan with, absolutely essential. Sam, any thoughts in terms of from your perspective? Again, we heard two different situations. Any feedback on the other two presenters?
Thanks, Jared. But I think very complimentary in many ways. I really appreciated Sergey's comments, which I think were really pertinent as a reminder that successful sort of energy transitions really need to recognize energy security, economic development goals. They need to still be people-centered, reflecting jobs. And I think CCUS is a very good fit for many economies, given it does provide an opportunity to continue to use fossil-based resources to transform industrial regions, which Bryony was just talking about as well. And I think, there's a huge opportunity here. But another takeaway, I think, from the discussion for me is really this importance of international cooperation and support. I think, the value of sharing the lessons and the experience from the international community, because there is significant experience there now with economies and countries that are looking at CCUS now as one of the solutions, is really going to be vital, and helping to also build the capacity and build the foundation for CCUS in many economies. I think there's a strong role there for like the UNECE, but also other organizations.
Thank you, Sam, for those thoughts. I see that Scott Foster's hand is up on the Zoom, and I have a note in the chat that says Norway has raised their flag. So, Scott, perhaps over to you to navigate either your question or a comment or question from Norway.
I think I'll defer to the country first. I will have a question, but let's call on Norway. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the very interesting contributions from the panel. I think it's clear that technology, as has been said, is is actually known. We have existing technology. We know how to do it. The key challenge is actually to make it happen and to find a suitable business model that make it attractive to invest in CCS. We have a concrete case in Norway, as you may know, the Longship project, which is about capturing CO2 from a cement factory owned by the Heidelberg Group, one of these industries which is hard to decarbonize. And it's clear it would not happen unless the government came forward with financing. And we're talking quite big money, 1.6 billion euros fully financed, including capturing, liquefaction, shipping, and storage. This project will capture 400,000 tons of CO2 every year. There's another project in Oslo, which is biofuel that could also be using this facility. And there we talk about negative CO2, another potential for the CCS technology. Now, the interesting aspect on this is that the storage capacity in the North Sea, safe storage, is prepared for much bigger volumes. And the whole idea by this investment is to attract further users. And that's why Equinor, Total Energies, and Shell is actually providing a service to carbon, transportation, and storage to the European industry. We have a lot of energy-intensive industries along the North Sea, around the North Sea. And I know they're talking to many players for potential use of this storage. Now, how is the economic incentive created? We have heard about carbon taxes, and it's clear that, as we heard also from Kazakhstan, we need to have the incentive to make this economic interest. It's hard enough in the wealthy societies, Western Europe, but we are very optimistic that we will see many cases coming forward. Another observation here, I saw the chart from IEA that the coal industry was quite big on the chart. And we heard from my colleague from Marco Gas that coal, rather than closing down the societies with huge costs for the societies, we could actually consider CCS. We have to balance the cost here, the social cost versus investment cost in CCS. So maybe, as we heard from the Kazakhstan intervention, in the future we can apply this technology also in other countries. But I think the key is to find a business model here, and not only for the carbon capture of these industries, but also potentially also for the hydrogen, creating blue hydrogen for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. Fully agree, and again, appreciate Norway's leadership in the space of CCUS. I think, as you mentioned, it's clear that we need to have governments and industry working together to find ways to deploy this at scale. And that's clearly a conversation in terms of business models that work, noting that it's not just one business model, but it's a business model depending on a unique country situation. It's a business model depending on which sector of our economy the CCUS is going to get deployed in. And again, there's a role for governments to make that work in the near term. There's a role for industry to build, own, and operate.
All right, we've lost Jared again briefly.
The global CCS community do to engage the financial community to do this. And if you look at some of the data coming out of Samantha McCullough's group at IEA, the order of magnitude of investment required across all the clean energy technologies is extremely large. CCUS is no different than any other. And to enable financing to flow, assuming we can get business models to work, requires conversation now with the financial community to make promising CCS projects financeable or bankable. That is something perhaps that would be of interest to our UNECE body as well. So plenty to talk about, but again, from from Norway fully appreciate and agree. Discussion on appropriate business models that can progress CCUS is absolutely critical for us to have government and industry working together. Scott, why don't we turn to you, and then Sigurd, I believe I see a hand up for you next. Scott.
Thank you very much, Jared. I think the comments that I would like to make, if we look back to what the executive secretary said when she spoke, we developed our recommendations. In fact, you were one of the leaders of that, along with Barry Worthington, recommendations to the UNFCCC regarding carbon capture and storage. And the argument was put forward that there was a need for policy parity with other low and no carbon energy sources at their same level of technology development. So where technologies were in an early stage of development, they got a major shot, and the request was made that maybe this technology merited the same treatment. We've now moved forward to 2021, and I'd be interested in the panel's views on whether any remnants of those recommendations still have merit, or if we've actually moved to a completely different world. And looking at the presentation from Samantha in particular, we seem to be in a very different place. The other aspect from 2014 was this CCUS, and the focus was very much with the U on enhanced oil recovery, because that was a critical element in providing the business model, the investment model for justifying the investments. This is where you were going to earn your money, and that any additional production of fossil would be captured in some coherent marketplace for CO2 emissions. Now we're moving, and you heard the discussions this morning, which are incomplete, on subsidies and greenhouse gas pricing mechanisms. We heard from Dr. Wilcox about direct air removal, and it'd be interesting to hear from the panel what kinds of pricing for greenhouse gases will underpin commercial scale and commercial operation of CCS and direct air removal. And then my final question, this is really too much. We had a great conversation with this Clean Energy Ministerial Group on CCS, and it seems like there's a fantastic opportunity for a collaborative, that there's no one organization or institution that will be doing it all, but collectively there's a lot we could do. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. I think I heard 4 or 5 questions in there, but perhaps we can just funnel those into a couple. I think, Sam, there were some questions that headed your way. Roger, perhaps you might take a question in terms of some of the cost trajectories from your view. And Sergey and Bryony, I don't know if you want to respond to any of Scott's. I think, Scott, to start off, I agree with you. It was a great conversation between the Clean Energy Ministerial's CCUS initiative and the UNECE body earlier this month. And I think at the bottom line, absolutely, we need to all collaborate and leverage each other's expertise and find ways to do, information exchange, knowledge exchange. Clearly, there are business models that are and could be transferable from one region to another, and we should share that information. I think a lot of CCS development will be built on sound legal and regulatory frameworks that are required to do anything at scale, especially in the subsurface. And there are things that we, as UNECE, can work with other organizations that have already been doing work in that regard. Clearly, there's good work to be done there. And then I think, back to Roger's point, in terms of what can be done for standards in markets that can actually help enable, all forms of low carbon or reduced carbon opportunities to be achieved is something I think that's near and dear and an opportunity for the UNECE. So a resounding yes, we should find ways to collaborate. But if that's my response on the Clean Energy Ministerial tidbit, Sam, perhaps we could go to you, then Roger, and then Bryony and Sergey.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Scott and Jared. There was quite a few questions in there, but maybe if I could just touch on first the the issue around policy support. And I think there's no question that we need to put CCUS technologies on a similar path as what we've now seen from renewable technologies, which did receive very significant public support in most regions. And they've now paved the way and shown us what's possible with that government support. And if I can just put this in the context of our net zero pathway, one of the findings is really that, you know, much of the emissions reductions that we need sort of globally to about 2030, most of that we can deliver with technologies that are commercial today. But getting to the deep emissions reductions post 2030 and certainly to a net zero pathway requires investment in technologies that in many cases haven't been demonstrated at scale and not yet commercial. And there are applications of CCUS where that applies. And so we need the early investment, and we need targeted investment to get these technologies to a stage where they can be commercially deployed. What that public support looks like, I think, you know, Jared already alluded to, will vary by region, by government policy preferences, by application that you're talking about for CCUS. What I think is quite interesting currently is looking at the European situation where the carbon price is now emerging as more of a driver for CCUS investment than it certainly would have in the past and would currently be in most regions. So I think a line of sight to higher carbon pricing, including by 2030, is really driving a lot of the interest in CCUS. But this is also coupled with, you know, very significant investment, including from Norway, in transport and storage infrastructure. And so I think just recognizing the, you know, we will need a kind of mix of measures and incentives to be able to really deploy CCUS at the scale needed. And there is a strong role for governments there in providing targeted support, and particularly, I would say, around the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure.
All right. Thank you, Sam, for those comments. Roger, thoughts?
I'd like to speak to your question about costs. This has been quite a problem in CCS over the years, as we've had aspirations to drive the cost to very low levels. And much of that has been driven by the success of wind and solar, that we've seen that these things became actually profitable solutions to pursue. And unfortunately, 20 years of CCS research has shown us that the costs are not going to drop below zero. They're going to remain costs. And in California, we've had an opportunity to test that with a thing called our low carbon fuel standard, which links the carbon intensity of liquid fuels to new developers, and where the money is basically transferred between the old users and the new users in order to obtain lower intensity fuels. And that price is now hovering around $170 a ton. And to me, that's a realistic view of what technology can do and what the markets are going to do. So I think that's something that we have to all take into consideration, that these are not gigantically low cost options. And they're also very high capital intensity. And that's probably the biggest thing that has kept the people from moving forward. As we heard from Norway, government capital is almost certainly required in order to get the initial operations up and running and to build confidence. And even at prices as we see in Europe today, I think that some capital intervention is going to be required in order to build that confidence that we can actually run and operate these things at the costs that I'm suggesting are probably north of $100 a ton. That's what we should expect to pay.
Yep. Thank you, Roger, for those data points and your perspective. Sergey or Bryony, thoughts? Sergey, perhaps first.
Обычно мы там выступаем. Но могу сказать следующее. Относительно рекомендаций, которые были разработаны, понятно, что они были разработаны на определенном этапе. И как любое меняется, если обстановка, то рекомендации должны совершенствоваться и выпускаться обновленные. Я думаю, это достойная работа для комитета. Вот. Прозвучало то, что вот нефти, на ней зарабатываются деньги, эти ресурсы могут быть использованы. Вот в Казахстане, да, большой объем нефти идет на экспорт, в частности в Европу. Однако этот ресурс заканчивается и заканчивается в обозримом будущем. Я видел работу интересную, которую выполнил Европейский банк реконструкции и развития, смотря на перспективу, когда в Казахстане нефть закончится, а это произойдет. Что нужно делать сегодня, как подготовиться к этому моменту, потому что, да, сейчас Казахстан снизил уровень бедности значительно за счет своих ресурсов, да, и много сделано, но чтобы эти деньги пошли на, так скажем, уху, я думаю, что это вряд ли. Ну, как говорится, источников мало, а расходов много. Поэтому все-таки мы будем ждать, когда эти технологии будут коммерчески выгодными в развитых странах, как я говорил. И, значит, в свое время уже будем смотреть, как это все правильно нам, как бизнес-модели, сделать и организовать. Спасибо.
Thank you, Sergey. Bryony?
I'll just make a couple of quick points. I think, talking about costs obviously important, but we need to remember the value of CCS as well. And it's the only way we know how to decarbonize huge swathes of industrial processes. So we need to bear in mind it's likely to have to be done, whatever the cost. I think it's also interesting to see questions being posed about the cost of direct air capture. It seems to me that we really need to get CCS itself underway and get the costs of that down and build on what we already know as our key priority. And I guess our view in the UK is direct air capture is likely to be quite expensive in the long term, but we do have a project underway to examine development of that system. But the main thing I wanted to say is obviously the business models are crucial. So the UK's approach to business model development has been published by the government. And there's been a lot of cooperative work with industry to see what kind of business models might be acceptable and incentivizing to industry. And I think that process has developed really rapidly over the last year. And all of our big projects are in very regular communication with the government about how those commercial negotiations will proceed. So I think there is certainly quite a lot of published information that people could have a look at if they were interested.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And again, I'll acknowledge that, at the COP coming up, there's conversations on Article 6 in terms of, markets as well that may support CCS deployment at scale in all of our nations. So plenty to discuss. And again, it all boils down here to finding business models that work in each, unique situation and policies and durable policy support that will be required, especially in the near term. Sigurd, your hand has been up very, very patiently. Please, the floor is yours for a question or comment.
Well, thank you, Jared, and many thanks to the Secretariat and the Bureau for arranging such an essential week as we have had up to now. I mentioned before here that the issue before us is really that the greenhouse gases increase temperature and their emission has to stop. So a child looking at that would say, if that is the case, we have to stop emissions, and that's the math. And the consequence of that is dramatic. But a schedule of allowable emissions is something that certainly is going to work. We've seen it, these bans applied before. We've seen it in incandescent lamps in Europe with lots of opposition, and our bulbs are much better than before. We saw it in flaring gas in Norway. A credible ban on flaring created a redesign of the resource management system, and every field has now an export or use option for the gas. And the same, I think, with CCS, but there has to be a credible roof on the emissions, a schedule of emissions. And then in addition to such a policy, of course, one has to carefully assess the consequences and for whom and when and where, and how do the consequences get managed. That may require additional policy measures. After that, the industry will be quite capable at deploying its very best capability to improve quality of life under those restrictions in a way that the capital market can finance. So the market will play an important role, and many of the issues that we have discussed this week will then come to life under such a constraint. Sorry if I'm rambling a bit in issues that you already know too well beforehand, but I'll stop there.
Oh, wonderful. And thank you, Sigurd, for that intervention, and fully agree. I think, the technical, political, and policy issues with regard to CCUS technologies are complex. Clearly, and I think we've had conversation here, we need to enable a business case for CCUS that could pave the way, and that requires work from government and industry and the financial sector to allow that to happen. Bankability or financeability of projects is essential if we're going to get these projects deployed at the scale we need to address, climate change mitigation. And so supporting policies and markets are the key. I think your earlier point in terms of, setting a cap and saying that needs to be firm, it's interesting in terms of policy development that varies country by country and region by region. And again, it all boils down to what is socially or societally acceptable. Very simplistically, you can set a cap and let the market then determine the price, or you can set a price on carbon and then that helps determine, the volume or amount that you actually reduce. And so philosophically, I think many countries face hardy discussions of what's the preferred approach. Some regions like cap and trade, and it's worked well, and Roger has experience there in California, and the United States has experience with pollutants in terms of cap and trade program, where you have certainty on the cap, and the price then changes and you have less certainty there. In some locations, Norway has a tax on carbon. The United States politics don't like taxes, but we're fine with tax credits, right? And so, whether you add a positive or subtract a negative, the math kind of works out the same. There needs to be a value for emission reduction, depending on how you frame it. But absolutely agree. I think that's the heart of the conversation. I think it brings it back to, a discussion here maybe for the panelists and to close out of, if we agree that business models to enable deployment are essential, if we agree that there's no one size fits all approach specific to CCUS technology deployment, let alone other, low carbon technology approaches, then, what is the role for the UNECE family to play here? We heard from Sergey and Bryony in terms of, very different circumstances, very different approaches in terms of what governments may be able to do in the near term, in the long term. I think there's no doubt that deploying these projects needs support from all stakeholders. We talked about not just a government role, but a private sector role, societal input, NGOs, and broader communities. We touched on the fact that we need to balance climate justice with economic justice and societal justice in terms of making sure that everybody in all communities are part of this transition to a more sustainable future. And so, perhaps just an open question to the panelists, from your perspective, both, inside and outside the UNECE family here, what are the key things that you think the UNECE and the Sustainable Energy Bureau could really, take to heart and pursue to advance our efforts here specific to CCUS? Maybe Sam, we can just go in the order and you can sort of start us off. And again, nothing at length, but just any kind of key thoughts for the group to think about.
No, thanks, Jared. I think I touched on earlier, and Jared, you've already covered this very well, just this value of having the international cooperation and collaboration. I think although maybe the progress with CCS hasn't always met expectations, we do have a great deal of experience with developing projects, some successfully, some not so successfully, but we can learn from both the successes and the projects that didn't go ahead. And I think it's really important, if we really want to accelerate these technologies and support widespread deployment, that we are, not making the same mistakes potentially in terms of how we design projects, in terms of how we design policies. And I think there's a great deal of wealth of knowledge out there that needs to be shared with countries that perhaps haven't had some direct experience with CCUS. I think there's still a significant capacity building task for many of the sort of emerging economies around developing legal and regulatory frameworks, around identifying, developing CO2 storage, also in designing policies to support CCUS. So I think these are areas where the UNECE can really play a role in bringing together the expertise and supporting that capacity building.
Great. No, thank you, Sam, for that. And maybe I'll take Chair's prerogative here. I had a note that Ray Pilcher has his hand up. I didn't see that, but Ray, if you've got something to add, I know you've been active within the UNECE family, so maybe a brief intervention here before we continue on with our panelists' last thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Jared, and I will make it brief. I just want to make an observation. The discussion with Mr. Kassiev was really centered around the Ekibatus basin, which happens to be in the north and, as you mentioned, closer to the oil and gas production. But in the southwestern part, the Karaganda Basin has an integrated complex of steel making and other metallurgical processing and some chemical plants as well. And the gas that's used, or the coal that's used there is quite gassy. And in fact, there's huge emissions of methane on an annual basis. When we talk about a business model, if you look at the potential to integrate reduction of methane emissions, use that methane, hydrogen reform, or steam reform of the gas, producing hydrogen, using it in steel making, or any other combination of those processes that develops a new and innovative business model that would attract the attention of I guess, finance from various groups. I think this is something that could really make some sense. And it also would sort of set a standard for a number of these industrial complexes that exist throughout Central Asia and other parts of Europe and North America. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, for that intervention and clear data point that there is much technical expertise around the UNECE family, and we should take that to heart as we find ways to all work together and collaborate. Roger, over to you.
One of the things the UNECE can do usefully is to focus on product standards for carbon intensity. Rather than saying how much we're emitting, we should say how much are we emitting per product, and that encourages innovation. It keeps the playing field level across the nations, and CCUS can be a vital part of that kind of system, as can other kinds of development. We don't want to focus on a single kind of innovation. We want to encourage all innovation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roger, for those closing thoughts. Sergey, any brief closing thoughts from you?
Ну, очень коротко, это распространение информации, это стимулирование дискуссий и разработка рекомендаций. Спасибо.
Wonderful, Sergey. And Bryony?
I don't think I could really presume to give you any advice. I think this has been an excellent panel, and one of the things I've really got out of it is just feeling this sort of consensus of, there's so much that is happening and needs to happen. So I think just sharing that experience is fantastic. One of the things we're very aware of in the UK is that getting costs down requires knowledge to be shared. And so I think, this forum providing opportunities to share knowledge with others will be really valuable. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for those closing comments, and thanks again to all our panelists and for everybody's participation in our healthy discussion today. I found it wonderfully thoughtful and provocative. It's clear that attaining the objectives of the Paris Agreement will not be possible without the deployment of CCUS in the EC region for those countries that will continue to use hydrocarbons. We should continue to pursue CCUS as part of that broad set of sustainable development tools across all of our carbon-intensive industries. And there's clearly plenty of good work to do here in the UNECE family. I would recommend the group of experts on cleaner electricity systems should lead, as they have been doing, in the issue of energy system transformation in cooperation with the experts we heard from other groups, and looking at not just the technical and the policy issues, but the societal nexus areas between CCUS, the other low carbon technologies, negative carbon technologies, as well as innovative solutions. For example, we talked on hydrogen about not just as a fuel, but as an energy storage medium that can help us decarbonize our overall society. So with that as brief concluding remarks, again, thank everybody for their time and attention, and I will turn it back to the chair, and I know we're right on time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jared, and the panelists, and thank you also for this lively discussion. We then come to an end for our afternoon session and agenda item 7. It was agreed upon that we continue now without the interpreters, just in English on the conclusions and recommendations. So that we at least keep a little bit the housekeeping rules we made at the beginning of our committee meeting. And then for tomorrow, we will continue, as far as I can see, also at 10 a.m. With the next point under agenda item 7, scaling up clean hydrogen in the UNECE region. So all have a good evening. Thank you. So I hope all can continue to be connected, who are interested in the common recommendations and conclusions. And once again, thank you for the interpreters for helping us over the day. But now I think we can manage it on our own. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could start with paragraph number 25, the one that we fixed yesterday on the that we fixed this afternoon. That's it. Very good. Go up. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to summarize, there were some questions that were raised yesterday that we would like to clarify. There was a separation of text regarding the global tracking framework. So we separated it out and it'll be renumbered properly. We say, noting the connections between the work on the Pathways program and the support for regional analyses under to track progress of ECE member states to the energy-related objectives of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, mandated the Secretariat to raise funds to support the regional work of the global tracking framework. We had discussed that with a few of you and it was acceptable. We'd like to make sure that there are no concerns. I see none and I see no hands coming up, so we can move right along. So if you can scroll down to where we were today, there is actually one under the buildings that we'd like to go through as well. So if you could stop there. A new paragraph number 32, and this related to the idea of a secretariat. There was a bit of confusion about what was meant. And what we have is a sequence and a series of international centers of excellence who have decided to pursue a coordination function that they would fund. In particular, the government of Ireland would like to provide funding for that secretariat, but it's not us. So we thought through how we would do that, and they do need a recommendation from this committee to open the channels for that funding to happen. So what we've used is the following. 32, the committee noted with appreciation the plans of the International Centers of Excellence to improve the coordination of their activities through support of their own self-funded secretariat. So I see no objections. If it would be possible to then scroll down. Unfortunately, my scroller is currently being distracted. I apologize, but
Mr. Foster.
when?
Oh,
Okay, we'll go quickly, but if we argue about it, we won't get there. If you could scroll down then to the next item that's open. That's gone too quickly, please. Could you go back up? (33C).
Yes, Scott, there's been discussion in the background because we learned that basically at 6:15, there's no more light, there's no more.
That's why we want to move quickly to get through what we can. So go to 33C, please. 23C. Which one is it? 33C? Thank you. Stop. The question was, we said Europe, and it needed to be more specific. So noted with appreciation the growing interest from member states, including in Kazakhstan, Russian Federation, Slovenia, UK, China, and Mexico, to establish international centers of excellence. So the only change there is putting the names of the countries rather than Europe. I see no comment or no hands, so if we can continue. Stop. Here we get to F, G, H, and I, and this is restructuring the paragraphs from what we had before. G, or actually it's the new G, it's just simply separating it out so it's clear. The committee noted the proposal from the Russian Federation to create a task force to develop a clean energy index as part of the development of UN RMS. That's a fact. H, the committee noted the potential for sustainable hydrogen resource management in sustainable energy transitions. I, pending availability of extra budgetary resources, requested the expert group on resource management and the groups of experts on gas and on clean electricity systems to develop international standards for hydrogen classification and management, including labeling according to its origin and CO2 footprint. And then number 2, more generally, and building on existing tools, a standard for transparency and traceability that compares, among other things, the carbon footprint of all energy sources on a life cycle assessment basis. I see no comments, so if we can you just scroll, please? We have here several paragraphs looking to see where there are conclusions. It's only paragraph number 35. The committee reiterated the need to continue to explore how best to address efficient use of resources, and in this regard, the impact of subsidies and carbon pricing options, and called on member states to provide extra budgetary resources to that end. In effect, it's reiterating the decision from the Commission and saying, go out and find funding to support, to provide extra budgetary resources to that end. Again, I'm surveying the room and the chat, and I see nothing, so let's continue. Item number 7, which is what we began today with the just transition. This is slightly longer, so I will need to read this. 39, actually I'll start with 38. The committee concluded that the transition to a carbon neutral economy, although technology driven, has a strong social component, just transition, aimed at achieving a greener and fairer society, and requested to explore organization of a region-wide forum on just transition, including preparing a draft agenda for review and approval by the committee. 39, the committee further noted that coal-based infrastructure is at the heart of industrial complexes that include mines, power stations, steel, cement, and concrete production, other affiliated industries, and urban areas in many member states. Further noted that substantial industrial and urban ecosystems have developed around the coal facilities and represent an important socioeconomic and hence political barrier to diversifying away from coal mining. Urged member states to support a just transition through industrial modernization to address short-term political drivers, notably employment in coal mining regions and the functioning of the local supply chains that should be considered as one of the factors in taking action on energy for sustainable development, including climate change. A long sentence, but it makes sense. Requested that the groups of experts collectively collaborate with other international organizations to develop principles or standards that address not only the technical, economic, and environmental issues associated with mine closure, but also the socioeconomic challenges faced by the surrounding communities and associated industries. Yes, European Union.
Very quickly, and I apologize, I think there is a comma missing in front of that to make sure that we are not referring only to the local supply chains, but that actually that should be considered as one of the factors in taking actions that we're referring to all that is said before.
Okay, so you want to put a comma between supply chains and the word that. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Paragraph number 40 then. The committee then invited member states to provide financial support for extra budgetary projects on just transition under the Sustainable Energy Sub-Program and urged its subsidiary bodies to build broad partnerships to increase the effectiveness of their actions on this topic, requested the groups of experts to submit an overview of challenges and barriers to a just transition in the ECE region. Woo, with a focus on coal mining regions. That was mood lighting. Can we keep going, or can we scroll down then? We need to, yeah, good. Please scroll down. All right. The committee recognizing that all, this is paragraph 42, the committee recognizing that not all countries take the same view of various technologies. Noted that electricity continues to be the critical energy vector driving and shaping energy systems transformations, that the power system will need to deliver greater demand flexibility and responsiveness, and that it will require a holistic approach and a technology open strategy involving accelerated deployment of the range of approaches. It is important, it remains critical, but in their current plan, they haven't got it in the 22-23 plan. And that's why this paragraph is there. So we want them to remember it, but we can't do it right away.